Okay, good morning, everybody. I'll just look to Becca for a thumbs up. Are we good to go? Great. So welcome everyone to our webinar today. Thanks so much for joining us. We're really looking forward to having you with us, sharing some really interesting insights, but most importantly, having your engagement, your questions and answers and conversation throughout the day. So this is our water stewardship webinar through the corporate lens. And we decided to kind of bring this perspective together because we know that a lot of you who are attending are catchment partnership practitioners, people who are working out in the field, often working with farmers, with a whole range of local businesses. And many of us come from a science or a catchment background, and we don't always have a very strong insight into what drives corporates and businesses into partnership with us through water stewardship. So we wanted to put this program together today to sort of share a slightly different perspective on the work that we're all doing together in partnership, and hope that through kind of broadening our perspective, we have a better understanding of what's motivating different partners to get involved. So we've got a really good attendance today, which is very exciting. And we've got some fabulous speakers lined up for you. I think most of us attending today are from the UK. A lot of catchment practitioners, a lot of people working in catchment partnerships, many people from our member rivers trusts around the country. But we also have quite a few businesses and corporates and some of the regulators joining as well. So a very warm welcome to all of you. We're really looking forward to showing you the presentations that we've got lined up. We're going to start off with Conor from WWF talking about water risk, because that's often a very big driver to getting the private sector involved in looking after catchments. And then Alex from the Rivers Trust is going to talk to us about water stewardship, a kind of a review and an introduction for any of those of you who aren't that familiar with it. And then we'll go to a little bit more detail with Peter Newborne from the Alliance for Water Stewardship, talking to us about their standard that they've been implementing for several years now. After the tea break, I'll give you a bit of an insight into corporate reporting, particularly sustainability reporting, that is now including a lot more around water and environmental social governance issues. And then Rylan Dobson will give us more detail on science-based targets and how that reporting has evolved over recent years. Rylan's with WWF, he's based in Canada, so he won't be available for questions and answers after that, but we'll try and handle them as best we can. Then we've got Kat Moncrieff from the Carbon Disclosure Project, also talking about other mechanisms for reporting and disclosing about water. And Ariane Laporte-Bisquit, who's in the German office of WWF, will talk to us about a new tool that they've developed looking at TCFD, climate-related financial disclosures, something that's becoming very prominent on the corporate agenda. And then, so that's kind of focusing on a lot of the tools and mechanisms that bring corporates, NGOs, and some of the regulators and government authorities together in partnerships to build, hopefully build better catchments. And after lunch, we'll be hearing from some of the sustainability practitioners from different corporates in a panel discussion with Alex Adam. So we've got Sarah Wakefield from the Co-op, Matthew Ryan from Nestle, Liz Lowe from Coke, and Christina Downen from Tesco, who will all be sharing their direct experiences about getting involved in water stewardship. So it's a very full day. We hope that you'll be able to stay with us for the whole day. Really looking forward to your questions. And I'm going to hand over to Becca now, who's going to just give us some of the housekeeping, not really rules, but guidance on how to engage in the day. Thanks, Becca.
Thanks, Christine, and morning, everyone. Very good to see so many people here already. So as Christine said, just a few housekeeping tips. Firstly, we do have closed captions, live auto captioning on today's webinar. The instructions are also in the chat, but you can enable this by going to the bottom of your screen and you'll see a little square with CC in and closed caption. If you click on that and then select show subtitle, then the captions will start. A bit of a disclaimer, they're not 100% accurate, but they should definitely give you the gist. And you can also change the font on those. So if you need to make them bigger, for example, you can also do that by right-clicking and going to subtitle settings. We'll also have a chat and Q&A function running throughout the day. So please just use the chat if you've got kind of tips or other comments or general responses to what anyone's saying. The Q&A is where you are best placed to post your questions for today's speakers. And you can also like questions that have been posted by other people that you particularly want to be answered. So please do use that function, because if we are running tight for time, which we might be, then we'll be prioritizing the questions that have the most likes. And then finally, just to confirm that this is being recorded, so something to be aware of, and please speak to one of us privately if there are any issues around that, but we're not expecting any privacy breaches here today. So I'll hand back to Christine.
Thanks, Becca. So we're now going to kick off with our first presentation, and this is from Conor Linstead. So we've got these recorded presentations, but Conor is also with us, so he'll be available to engage with you and take questions about some of the issues that he's raised in his presentation. And he's going to talk to us about water risk, particularly water risk in the UK, and how WWF's water risk filter helps companies to start seeing, understanding and acting on where they are facing water risk. Thank you.
Okay, I'm just going to bring Conor in as a panelist, and then I'll start his video.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Conor Linstead and I work in the science team at WWF-UK as a freshwater specialist. Much of my role focuses on the work that we do with businesses on water. This is largely in the context of food and drink businesses, but does cut across other sectors to a lesser extent, such as textiles and consumer goods. I also tend to focus on global supply chains rather than in the UK, but I've been involved in a minor capacity for some years in the work that we've done in the UK with corporates. What I want to talk about today are three things. So firstly, why as a conservation organisation does WWF engage with corporates on water issues? I'd then like to talk briefly about the development of water stewardship and what I've seen, how it's evolved over recent years. And then finally offer some observations on how the UK water stewardship context is different from other countries. In particular, what are the specific business water risks that businesses operating in the UK face? So why, as a conservation organisation, should we engage with businesses on water? Well, I think at its core, the root cause of problems with rivers and freshwater habitats, be that a flow problem or a water quality problem or a habitat problem, is a failure in governance. And there can be many reasons why governance falls short, which I think hold true as much in the UK as anywhere. There can be things like a lack of basic legislation, badly designed legislation that favours one set of stakeholders at the expense of others or the environment, a lack of implementation, for example, the translation of legislation into operational institutions, inadequate regulation and enforcement, a lack of funding, a lack of capacity, political will, and so on. And the same issues of flow or water quality are not only having an impact on ecosystems, but they're also having an impact on businesses. They pose water risks to businesses. And broadly, these risks are the risks related to the physical risk of a business running out of water of a sufficient quality or sufficient quantity to run its operations. There are reputational risks that arise from an actual or perceived impact from businesses on their supply chains or other water users. And then there are regulatory risks where businesses are impacted by regulation or lack of regulation. And just to be clear, when we talk about regulatory risk, we and the businesses that we work with are in favour of regulation. The risk part of the regulatory risk comes from sudden, unanticipated or arbitrary changes to regulation, or perhaps where poor practices in supply chains can affect their own production or supply downstream. And there are therefore impacts on businesses' own operations through these regulatory mechanisms. In fact, we often hear from businesses that the point that better performing businesses would like better regulation to level the playing field with their competitors. So from a conservation perspective, then we can share a common purpose with businesses in addressing water risks. These are shared between the businesses and ecosystems. And addressing the root causes which lie in governance, as I said, can benefit both businesses and ecosystems. And of course, working with businesses, they can bring a number of things to the table, particularly influence. And that's influence on their operations, clearly, but also on their supply chains, influence on their sector peers, and even influence in terms of policymakers to addressing that root cause of that governance root cause issue. And they can also bring resources, although I would caution that in my experience, it's unusual to get a single business to fund at a large enough scale and for long enough to really deliver change on the ground. And possibly another note of caution to add, leveraging business influence on policy does come with risks of its own, and we need to be very careful that we do that in a way that's fair and transparent. So I'd just like to sketch out now the evolution, as I see it, of water stewardship and the developments that it rests on. This isn't intended to be an academic analysis of water stewardship, but I hope just gives some sense of how I've seen it evolve, and I think sets some important context for why businesses want to engage in catchment on water issues. Going back decades, business engagement on water issues was mostly about compliance with legislation, either on abstractions or discharge water quality. Then you start to see businesses, some of the leading businesses, start to think about putting in place best practices. So going over and above what's the legal minimum, largely as part of their environmental or sustainability agendas, and often underpinned by environmental management systems at a site level, setting targets around things like water use and efficiency at the site level. The beginnings of water stewardship really start to happen when corporates start to adopt volumetric targets focused outside of their own operations, so outside their fence lines. Coca-Cola are a good example of this, setting out global replenish targets back as far as 2007, I think. And their replenish target was to put back into nature a volume of water equivalent to the volume of their products. And these type of approaches are still very much in evidence. They have only, I think, last week announced their target to replenish the volume of water consumed in their production. Some of the early efforts on volumetric related targets, though, from many corporates were problematic, I think, from a conservation perspective, as the projects they drove were not tied to the same catchments as the production sites, so they weren't necessarily really addressing the impacts of that production. And it became an exercise in finding projects that delivered the biggest volumes to meet their targets and not really being prioritized to address key pressures. I think over time, there was a realization and a recognition that these volumetric water stewardship targets need to focus more on material issues and risks, and projects need to be tied to sites where companies had production or where they had supply chains. And I think the work that we've done with WWF-UK and Coca-Cola has been a very good example of this, I think, where We've previously worked with them on a river restoration project in the Cray, where one of their factories is located. And we're continuing to work with them in East Anglia in the context of their sugar beet supply chain. And I think Rylan is going to speak later more about the latest developments in this area of science-based water targets. So thinking much more about the context of how business is operating and tailoring their corporate water targets to that. Even with the best will in the world, though, an individual company is not going to shift the dial at a catchment scale on water pressures and water problems. There's a recognition that what we need to do, I think, now is we need to start really building momentum behind collective action at scale. And Alex is going to speak later about the Courtauld Commitment, which I think is a very good example of businesses in the food and drink sector coming together to work at this scale. So achieving much more together than the individual efforts can from any particular company. And then finally, as I've said, water problems are almost always, they have a governance failure as their root cause. And that's why I think we need to move beyond even collective action, where we've got multiple actors, multiple businesses and other stakeholders working together in a catchment, to actually think about how we jointly advocate with businesses on water management issues, advocate to government and to government agencies. And we've seen some emerging examples of this happening in the UK, but not very many. And I think we've still got some way to go. But I think this is certainly the direction I think we need to be travelling in terms of our water stewardship development. So this is a very general model of water stewardship development. And I think there's a few notable exceptions to general rule. So, for example, bottled water companies were a very early adopter of catchment approaches and collective action, because there's a very direct physical risk to their sources. And similarly, I think the journey and the motivations have been somewhat different in different sectors too. So the reputational risks to large brands that are big water users, especially the drinks manufacturers, so the reputational risk were the key driver for them. But for lower profile businesses, so ones which are not big brands, there's been a much more of an emphasis on physical risks, especially where they're operating in water scarce areas. For retailers, if they've got a small operational water use, they never really felt the same pressure to adopt volumetric targets. So largely, we've seen those businesses move straight from operating best practice at a site level to thinking about supply chains and collective action at that scale. So I think along with this evolution of water stewardship, there's been a shift in the types of risks that businesses are thinking about. Early on, I think the main motivation was around regulatory risks, and some of the early adopters of water stewardship were often motivated by that reputational risk piece. But now, with a much greater focus on climate change, I think the physical water risk considerations are coming to the fore. But businesses are now also starting to think about the value that they gain from being good water stewards. So increasingly, we're seeing discussion at global events on water stewardship about the value of adopting a water stewardship approach. So not just about mitigating risks, but about creating shared value. So the UK context for water stewardship, I think, is quite different to the global context, where most of the early developments have happened. Typically, at a global level, corporate engagement has been focused on the issue of water scarcity and the different types of risks associated with that. Maybe the big exception to that is the clothing sector, which has a particular water quality problem. There's been a general perception of the UK, I think, in corporate water stewardship circles as having a comparatively low water risk because of the climate, the comparatively strong water management governance framework, and the fact that agricultural supply chains tend not to be irrigated. And I think because businesses often get their water supply via a water company, so there's only an indirect relationship with the source, which is unusual in a global context. I mean, that is, of course, not to say that we don't have scarcity issues here. It's just that for the most part, water scarcity in the UK is largely driven by domestic water consumption, apart from some pockets of irrigation at some times of year. So manufacturing sites using water tend to see their risk mitigated by the water company, and they see it as a separate issue and something that the water company should be dealing with. I do think that the issue of irrigation and its connection with water scarcity is important in the UK, and I think even if small compared to domestic use, it's an overlooked topic and something that's going to grow in importance in the future. I think the main issue for businesses with agricultural supply chains is diffuse pollution, and there's no smoking gun there tying particular supply chains of businesses to particular pollution issues. So reputational risks for food and drinks businesses are low in this respect. If there are point source pollution issues like in agriculture, like a slurry tank failure or a massive erosion, it's rarely tied to specific retailers buying from that farm. So if it gets reported in the media, it will get reported as a farm issue, not a supply chain issue. And this is in contrast, I think, to global supply chains where individual retailers are frequently identified in articles in the media about the impact of strawberries from Spain that they're procuring, asparagus from Peru, avocados from Chile, for instance. And I think this discrepancy between how these issues are reported in the UK and globally, I think, serves to entrench these views. But right now, I think in general, corporate engagement in water stewardship in the UK is largely driven around this issue of reputational gain, the business value that I was talking about earlier, and also by their sustainability agendas. It's not so much a recognition of the core business water risks, except in a few cases. It's often about them doing the right thing. It's about reducing environmental impact. It's about supporting suppliers and ensuring best practice in their operations and supply chains. But I do think this is shifting, and I think it will continue to do so. And this is often driven by the climate change agenda rather than a water-specific agenda. So, and this is in relation to requirements to disclose climate risks, which, as we know, are largely will happen through water, through drought and flooding, for instance, and also a growing recognition that improving their climate resilience can be done through a water stewardship approach. And Ariane is going to speak later, I think, about the new climate scenarios that we've got within the WWF water risk filter, which is intended to support this approach. So the water risk filter is one of the key tools that we use at WWF to engage businesses on water risks. It's a free tool, so it's an online tool that allows businesses to enter the location of their operations or the locations of their supply chains. And it provides an assessment of the water risk to those sites in terms of physical, reputational, or regulatory risks. So it scores between 1 and 5 from low risk to high risk in each of those categories and a number of subcategories. So the main tool, it's global in scope, and it layers multiple data sets with a global coverage to derive risk scores for that at that business unit level. But from a number of countries, including Great Britain, it's been downscaled. So we weren't able, unfortunately, to get data from Northern Ireland, so we don't have full UK scope, but we've got this GB coverage. So the downscaling process swaps out the global layers of water risk with national data sets that have a finer resolution and accuracy, but still provide the same type of indicators as the global tool. So there's a consistency in that framework. For GB, this meant replacing water quality and ecosystem data from the global tool with specific data from the Water Framework Directive, the different elements within the Water Framework Directive. We replaced global water scarcity model data with data from the EA catchment inspection management strategies and flood risk maps from EA and other agencies as well. So there's a much finer resolution and a much more accurate picture of water risks using this tool and using the downscale data. And certainly in my own work, I found that using the water risk filter is a really useful tool for the initial engagement of businesses on water stewardship. It often acts as the entry point for discussions with businesses. And once they run the tool and assess their sites and understood their water risks, they'll often get in touch with us to discuss the potential for developing mitigation plans. And I've shared the URL on the slide, so please do go and have a look and see if it can support you in your water stewardship development. just to sum up, I think there are some real water risks for businesses, and there's, I think, a mutual benefit for conservation organisations working together with businesses to address them through a water stewardship framework. That said, the context within which water stewardship has been developed is quite different, I think, to the UK, and that does require a somewhat different perspective and a different approach. But I've seen it develop over the last few years now, and I really think that there's no doubt that this agenda is going to continue to grow. And engaging businesses in catchment management is really going to support that development and move us forward in terms of developing a sustainable water management. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Becca. Conor, are you with us? Thanks, Conor. Thanks for your presentation. I don't see any questions in the Q&A, but just a quick note to Becca. I wasn't actually sure how to put in the question when I opened it up. So I hope that it is working fully. So just to the participants, if you have a question for Conor based on the presentation, add it either into preferably the Q&A if you can, or the chat if there is a problem with the Q&A. Conor, thanks so much for that. We know that water risk is really important as a driver for getting corporates involved in collective action around water security and water resilience. Can you give us an indication of the number of businesses that have used the water risk filter for the UK specifically? And if there are any particular sectors that have been dominant in trying to kind of get to grips with the detail of their water risk?
So it's been used so at a global level. There are hundreds of thousands of sites that have been assessed using the water risk filter. I don't know the precise number for the UK, but the UK is the second biggest user of the water risk filter. So in terms of the sites that are going into it, it's largely I'd say food and drink sector businesses. So either at the retailer level, looking at assessing risks of their supply chain, so looking at producers within their supply chain, or it's brands who have manufacturing sites or supply chains within the UK. So that it's largely those types of businesses that are using it at the moment.
Okay, great. And I can see the Q&A's working now. So we've got some questions in. I'll just relay them to you, Conor. So I think a little bit linked to that, but from the catchment practitioner's perspective, which sectors would you recommend the guys who are working on the ground in catchments looking out for and getting involved with on a basis of risk? That's a question from Robin Page Coleman.
So I think I wouldn't be too concerned about specific sectors as such. I think I suppose it depends on your motivations, but I would start from the point of view of thinking about the catchment that you're in, and mapping out the businesses that are in that operate in that catchment who have dependency, and that will vary from place to place. So it may be that you have a large brewer in your catchment, and that might be the entry point to start to get engagement and start to get partnerships to develop around water stewardship. I mean, the other obvious entry point is to think about what types of produce, so what type of production, agricultural production you've got. Is it dairy, or is it beef, cereals, and so on, and then try to map out what you can. I mean, sometimes it's quite difficult because the information just isn't there publicly, but try to map out who's the ultimate buyer of that produce and engage at that point, because mostly these either large corporates who have those supply chain links, they will have a sustainability agenda, and water will be part of that. So rather than try and develop water stewardship around at the producer level, actually think about where all that is going, where's that supply chain leading to, and engage at that level, and then you can start to think about developing programs. And I mean, sometimes that means maybe going beyond your own organization and thinking about, well, so if it's you identify a particular endpoint of that supply chain, it may be that either they're in partnership with WWF or some other organization. So maybe that's the entry point to it.
Yeah, work through an intermediary if they exist as well.
Yeah.
We've just got 1 more minute before we move over to Alex, and it would be great, Conor, if you could, as we move on to the next presentation, maybe answer some of the questions that are in the Q&A section as well, because there are quite a lot in there and we haven't had a chance to get to them all. But just to finish off with one more, the water risk filter as it is at the moment, as I understand it, it's not possible to identify the companies within a particular catchment or area who've gone on there and looked for their water risk or who are present. At a global scale, we used to be able to use the Water Action Hub for that, to see where corporates have kind of put up their hands and said, we're here, we're concerned about water. Is there anything that the water risk filter can offer in that regard, or is there anything coming linked to that? What would you recommend?
So there are always issues around data confidentiality with using these types of tools. So and even within WWF, there's some degree of separation in terms of the team that run the water risk filter and the rest of us in national offices who can access that data, because we need to have a coordinated approach. So at the moment, the entry point would be to come through me, I think, okay. And then I can try and broker those conversations within WWF.
Okay, great. Thanks so much, Conor. Thank you. Great presentation. And I will hand over now to Alex, who's going to talk to us about water stewardship in action in the UK, and in particular some lessons learned from the Courtauld Commitment. Thank you, Alex.
Okay, I'm hoping everyone can hear me now. I'm just going to follow up quickly, conscious of time, just a quick overview, picking up some of the themes that Conor's talked about in terms of water stewardship in practice in the UK, and particularly give some examples of some of the work that's gone on, which I'm hoping might address some of the questions that have appeared in chat so far, and share some very high level lessons learned. But as again, time is against us, so it will be quite high level, but if people have specific questions or further want to pick up particular issues, please get in contact on the back of this. So to start off with, I use this as a starting for nearly every presentation I do. And I do it because I think it illustrates really well the importance around water and this wider resilience point, because I think certainly from my perspective and some of the kind of conversations over the last few years, is a lot of people think of water stewardship purely from it's all about water. But actually, I think one of the benefits the approach is alluded to by Conor is that it starts to pick up a whole range of different sort of sustainability issues. So through water quality, to soil health, to flooding, to reducing operational risk, to biodiversity, so on and so forth. And I often say sort of water in many ways is the currency in natural capital, because for many who start to embark on this journey, it does actually provide the kind of golden thread, for want of a better term, of sort of that can underpin or run through all their sustainability objectives and ambitions. Just a quick sort of slide by way of intro in terms of myself. I'm Alex Adam, Head of Water Stewardship, or CaBA Water Stewardship at the Rivers Trust. The Water Stewardship Service was set up originally about 3 years ago with support from WWF and Coca-Cola. And that was on the back of their realization that they are kind of key leaders in water stewardship, but there's only so far they can go. they need to encourage collaborative action, and actually we need to get more people working on the same issues in the same areas to drive that change that we all know we need to deliver. Subsequent to that sort of initial support, that's been further support from M&S, Tesco's, Prince of Wales Charitable Foundation, and it's actually sort of part and parcel of a European Interreg Water Cog project. So a lot of the learnings from this sort of exercise and through the service we are kind of keen to share across a range of different programs and partners. So I sort of, in essence, the Water Stewardship Service is really about trying to join up the dots. And I think there was a question raised on the chat earlier about support through WWF to corporates. Again, not just me, obviously Conor, but there's a group of us who are helping, trying to do this sort of Cilla Black role of joining up the dots between businesses who are interested in water stewardship or leading on water stewardship and, the catchment partnerships on the ground. That's a two-way process, though. I think it's not all business definition. I think, as Conor's alluded to, where there are catchment partnerships, where there are issues, we are well placed to help kind of facilitate some of that join up where appropriate. Just quickly touching on the water stewardship ladder, which is my interpretation. Conor's done an earlier version. It's quite a well-defined process. There are quite well-defined steps in that process, and you will no doubt see a number of iterations of the stewardship ladder throughout the day. But my particular area of interest is this point around collective action. So, the first 3 steps in the process are very much sort of internal business focused. That was within their own gift. It's all within the factory gate to a greater or less degree. The challenge comes when it's those sort of upper catchment, those wider issues where a business, no matter how big they are or how influential, is seeking to address some of these issues, but they're not going to be able to do it themselves. So they need to work together in unison and in partnership and in collaboration with other businesses, which sounds great in principle, but actually it's quite challenging. I've also, on the right of this slide, put the water stewardship definition. And I think this is a really, really helpful framework. I think, for me, the revelation for water stewardship is it does provide a sort of a bridge between, in terms of the language that is used between, should we say, catchment partnerships and the traditional NGO sector and businesses, because actually it does start to provide a common frame and a common language that can help drive improvements on the ground. The key bit in terms of the definition is achieved through a stakeholder inclusive process that includes both site and catchment based actions. And for those of you who are on or involved in catchment partnerships, that will be, I guess, music to your ears. So recognising we do have quite a broad audience with us today. So we've got the business interest and this principle around water stewardship and collaborative action. We then have the catchment partnerships, and we've got 105 across England. They're developing plans around water, but more. So it's looking at how the health of the catchment and the soil and everything else associated with that. There's a whole plethora of different organisations. I think the last count there was 2,000 organisations. Appreciate some catchment partnerships at different levels of maturity. So some have very well-defined plans. Others are still working those through. But as a framework for delivery, as a conceptual basis, but actually also in a reality, for those businesses who are looking to be good water stewards and do address water stewardship principles within the catchment, there is an absolutely critical role for catchment partnerships. Because actually, if we can get this right, and if we can join up those dots, those businesses who are leading in water stewardship and those who will inevitably follow, because I think this has become a very rich issue in years to come, the catchment partnership, in theory at least, should be incredibly well placed to identify both the opportunities, projects, and work in partnership to deliver those. So just a couple of examples quickly. I'm going to firstly touch on some ones that really started, certainly the kind of initiation of the water stewardship service and some of the work, more kind of proactive work on water stewardship in the UK. And that was the partnership initially with WWF and Coca-Cola, and more latterly with ourselves at the Rivers Trust. But over the last, I think it's sort of 6 years, there's been a range of projects, and I put these up on the screen because I think it illustrates how water stewardship and through water stewardship can start to pick up and address lots of different environmental issues. So There's the work that's been going on down at Ham Fen about restoring ancient fenland. There's the reducing urban runoff into Richmond Park and taking the pollutants out of the river, which has improved up to 5 kilometres of habitat, provided a local amenity benefit. There's Broomfield Park, which is a significant wetland, which was developed with Thames 21 Enfield Council support through the Coca-Cola Foundation. Now that wetland has, and there's quite a lot of information online which I'd encourage you to look at, has delivered multiple benefits for the local community. It's derived benefits for the Coca-Cola plant. It's provided flood risk benefits, educational benefits, and a real amenity value whilst cleaning up the water. So there's a whole range of different benefits there. And the final one on this side is around the water sensitive farming work that's been going on in sort of Cameo and Broadlands catchment for quite a few years, which is a really good example of how Coke, through their supply chain, and key ingredients are sugar and water, have been working with their supply chains in the Cameo region to drive improvement, support best practice in terms of soil health, farm improvement, regenerative processes. Now, that has been the catalyst actually for wider collective action. So on the back of that work that was originally kind of supported and developed by Coke, Tesco's but also got involved, recognising they also source from that similar area. And that, I'm not saying was the origins, but I think that helped spur the Courtauld collective action work. Courtauld 2025, many of you will be aware, Courtauld has been in existence for, I think, 15, 18 years or now. Work is primarily focused on food waste, then packaging waste. And as of a few years ago, there was a new target around water, recognising that this can only be addressed through collaborative action. So for about the last 2.5 years or so, we've been working on some collaborative action pilot projects across a number of catchments in the UK. The thinking being that we can take these kind of pilot areas, there'll be a lot of lessons learned, there'll be some good practice, there'll be some bad practice, but the ambition is that we start to get this collaborative approach, learn those lessons, and then start to try and scale that up into other catchment areas. The map on the right here, you can see, is just a kind of very high level illustration of the areas that we're looking at and working in. Cameo and Broadlands, again, building on the work that was already going on there, very much sort of arable mixed products. So most suppliers supply at least one thing from that neck of the woods or source one thing from that neck of the woods. Kent and the Medway, that's being led by South East Rivers Trust with likes of Berry Gardens, Worldwide Fruit. And that's a project that's looking at sort of how do we adopt nature-based solutions to start to kind of build the resilience of the horticulture sector in that neck of the woods. Key sourcing area, massively important industry, but there are some very real issues in terms of water shortages. So what can we do through working with the farmers and the supply chains to identify best practice approaches where we might be able to capture some of that water and runoff from all those polytunnels in the winter and then reapply that back into the production process, but also wider environmental benefits. Likewise, in the Southwest, this is very much building on the best practice of upstream thinking. So all these projects are building best practice. This is not about reinventing wheels, but the focus in the Southwest is about dairy, which is a very intensive dairy area. Nearly everybody sources some level of dairy down there. Building on the best practice approaches, upstream thinking in the West Country Rivers Trust, working with farmers to put in place interventions. Now, there's been a whole raft of sort of spin-off benefits to some of these discussions, which we can come to in a moment. Finally, the why and ask, mixed produce, some big issues in terms of poultry production in that neck of the woods. But again, it's provided a really useful catalyst to start to bring the farmers, the growers, the retailers and others together to understand both the issues and opportunities. So some of the outcomes of the pilot projects that we've delivered today, and we've still got a long way to go, I have to say, is we've just looked at governance. So actually one of the things that we think works really well from some of these projects is having some kind of business board aligned to the catchment partnership. Catchment partnerships are great, but sometimes those four are not appropriate. So putting in place specific business boards on a kind of biannual basis to discuss both issues and opportunities and start to get in that collaborative action piece. is really, really useful. They take time, but it's really helpful. We've been lucky to secure quite a lot of direct funding, but with all things catchment related, we then actually, on the back of that direct funding from the partners and elsewhere, we've been able to leverage in, or the group projects have been able to leverage in significant other funding, from aligning with existing projects that might be going on the ground, so supported by water companies or others, but equally through that supply chain engagement, we've been able to talk to farmers and kind of put quite a lot of the solutions have been put through the countryside stewardship scheme. So on the back of the supply chain engagement and the farmer engagement, we've identified issues, but also opportunities to resolve those. Lots of farmers engaged, lots of trees being planted, and that 51 million litres of water replenished thus far, but these calculations need to be updated. So the replenish is a metric we can come back to, but actually this water benefits accounting has been a really good metric which we're looking to pilot across the catchments in order to provide a kind of consistent metric to measure outputs. I think one of the things that's key learnings for me has been that actually, despite what our objectives have been, the journeys are taking us off in different ways. And I'll come to some of those lessons in a moment. But for more details on each of these projects, and we'll circulate the link, I would suggest everyone looks at the Courtauld annual report, which came out about 4 weeks ago, because there's some much more detailed write-ups of the case studies there. I'm conscious of time, but some of the lessons that we learned thus far, it takes a lot of time. Building the relationships, having the discussions, it takes a lot of time. Even when you've got clear commitments from some partners. One of the key things is that actually people talk about supply chains, but in most instances, most people supply from most other people. So it's very rare where you have one supplier providing to one retailer or one supply chain. It's very often that many people are supplying to many, which is why I think taking that kind of place-based approach is so important. It's a completely different way of thinking for many. The concept of water stewardship, the concept of collaborative action is a big step forward for many, and we need to recognise that. As Conor mentioned, it's not all about the money. That helps. Actually, it's as much about the influence and both sort of within supply chains, but also across governance. But where there is money, it's actually very often easy to leverage and blend and increase that quite considerably. It does require leadership at all levels to make this work. You need a kind of degree of faith, you need a lot of trust, and you need people to sort of blink first to make this stuff happen. From a catchment partnership perspective, I cannot stress how important and useful things like story maps are and CaBA plans that are easily and readily accessible. They're the shop window. There's about being proactive with businesses, but equally you need to make it easy for businesses to kind of come to you and know who you are and who to contact. I've already talked about business fora. I think one of the key lessons is that it's very fragmented out there in terms of delivery, and we don't perhaps help ourselves as a sector. And I think there is more that we can do through the water stewardship plan, CaBA plans, and a bit more integration on the ground to make that easier. But water stewardship actually provides a really helpful common language that starts to bridge this gap and encourage systemic change within the sustainability agenda between, shall we say, local delivery partners and corporates. In terms of next steps, we're going to continue with the projects, hopefully more businesses, more growers, more partners. There's this snowball effect with the projects. We're building capacity to help with the replenish calculations, formalising some lessons learned, which I hope we can do in May next year. I'm really keen that we do an independent review of where we've got to so far, so we've got that formal lessons learned that we can show, both with businesses, but actually other catchment partnerships. The issue of scale's been made a number of times through the project groups, and one of the things we're looking to do to achieve that is to build this environmental farm hub, where actually on a kind of website basis, a portal basis, we bring together key environmental information, opportunities in terms of all the kind of grant support through water companies and other things, and actually sources of advice. So both from a grower perspective, but also a retailer perspective, that information could be more readily available, because we know that's one of the key barriers. Looking at developing a water stewardship roadmap to help kind of set out the steps within water stewardship. This is going to be done through the auspices of RAP and the Courtauld projects, and there's talk and potential about extending Courtauld more fully. And I think I will stop sharing there and go to any questions if anybody has any.
Yeah, so Alex, we have had a few questions coming in on the Q&A so far. So I'll start with one that should be fairly simple. So Sarah Wells has said, can we find out what businesses are signed up to the Courtauld commitments and therefore identify which may be appropriate in specific catchments?
Yes, you can go to the Courtauld website where I believe there is a list of those businesses. Kind of word of caution, Rachel, supply chains are very, very complicated. Now, obviously, there's kind of, you'll understand where the businesses are and their sites, and there might be that operational side of things. But one of my lessons is that, or learnings, is that supply chains are complicated and go everywhere. So just because a business is located in a patch doesn't necessarily mean they have a significant footprint there.
Okay, thanks. Next question is from Robin. So she said, thanks for this fantastic overview. Do you have any data quantifying the carbon sink / carbon reduction benefits of catchment projects alongside or similar to the financial returns?
Wow, there's a question. We have quite a lot of data and growing evidence base in terms of, should we say, the carbon sequestration benefits of individual intervention. So wetlands being case in point, massive opportunities for carbon sequestration. The soil carbon debate still rages, and I don't believe there's a definitive metric there yet. That will be there in the fullness of time. I think it's very difficult to manage the impact of these things at a catchment scale, even at a sub-catchment scale. But the individual interventions can be measured, and actually sort of subject to the scale of the ambition, there are other metrics that can be put in place that can also act as proxies. And there's probably some very sophisticated modelling out there that I'm not aware of that will tell you all this as well.
Great, thanks. I'm sure Robin really appreciates that answer. It's time for us to move on to our next session. So I'm just going to line up Peter Newborne as a panelist. So thanks, Alex. There are some more questions in the Q&A and the chat if you do get time to type your answers to them. But I'll move on to our next session, the introduction to the Alliance for Water Stewardship Standard. And I am going to get Peter's presentation lined up now for us.
Good morning. My name's Peter Newborne. I'm the AWS Regional Coordinator for Europe. Thank you very much for inviting me to this session on water stewardship through the corporate lens. I'm going to give a short introduction to the AWS standard and system. So this is water stewardship as promoted and supported by AWS, the Alliance for Water Stewardship. I think at the same time, I will try some first thoughts on a comparison of AWS and CaBA, looking at some common characteristics and what seem to be complementary approaches by the two. Now, these are first thoughts, and I'd be interested to hear what you think. I've not actually myself been intimately involved in CaBA. I did work for WWF-UK some years ago, but that was pre-CaBA. So as I say, your guidance at the end will be appreciated. So let's look at the AWS standard and system. The Alliance for Water Stewardship is a global membership collaboration of businesses, civil society, and the public sector. AWS members share a common definition and approach to water stewardship as expressed in the AWS standard. Now here is an image of some AWS members, and you'll see that there are a number of corporates whose names you'll recognize, as well as civil society organizations and government bodies. Now, this is just a selection of AWS members, but it'll give you a feel of some of those who are participating in this water stewardship initiative, both in Europe and beyond. And these are new members who've joined AWS this year, 2020. You'll note in the UK, Sainsbury's and Unilever, as well as a number of NGOs and other corporates. And this was a lot of members who've joined in this past year, despite COVID, which was reassuring. Now let's look at the definition of water stewardship as per AWS. This is the use of water that is socially and culturally equitable, environmentally sustainable, and economically beneficial, achieved through a stakeholder-inclusive process that involves site and catchment-based actions. A site here means a manufacturing plant or factory, or a farm, or other business premises, or indeed it could be a public building if the water user is a public body. The AWS standard requires aspiring water stewards to look beyond their own sites to the local water catchment. The mission of AWS is to promote and support local and global leadership in credible water stewardship that recognizes and secures the social, cultural, environmental, and economic value of fresh water. Now, this slide shows, as you'll see, different manifestations and uses of water resources, both in nature and use by humans, with agriculture particularly highlighted because, as you well know, that accounts for a very large proportion of water consumed for production of food and fabrics, estimated at 70–80% or more of total global water use. Now, the AWS standard is a set of principles and steps which provides a robust practical guide for achieving stewardship. It's, in other words, a voluntary code of best practice in water management. And you can download the standard on the AWS website. But let's look at these 5 steps of the AWS standard. The first step is entitled Gather and Understand. And here the aspiring water stewardship is required to collect and compile data and information on shared water challenges so as to understand how water behaves and moves in the environment and its associated risks. And that particularly means how the site's water use affects other water users and vice versa. The physical scope of gathering data and information covers also the scope of stakeholders' interests and the regulatory landscape. I mean, that's because, of course, water scarcity may be physical, and it may also be economic and political. There may be issues and problems of water management in and around the site and the catchment. Good water governance requires most fundamentally coordination and collaboration in relation to a resource which, of course, we have to share in AWS parlance, collective action. Now, here is an example from the AWS standard document itself. You'll see the criteria and indicators. This is the first criterion, 1.1, which is the call to gather information to define the site's physical scope for water stewardship purposes, as I just referred. And you'll see on the right, the indicator 1.1.1 requires the physical scope of the site to be mapped, considering the regulatory landscape and zone of stakeholder interests. And then it goes into more detail. And indicator 121 below talks about the stakeholders. Stakeholders and their water-related challenges shall be identified. And then the water steward applying the standard follows the more detailed provisions of the indicator. Step 1.4 is important. Thereby, aspiring water stewardships need to look at their supply chains to understand the water consumed during production and processing of primary inputs to their operations, the embedded water use in catchments of origin. Step 2 is entitled Commit and Plan. This is where the water steward commits to be a responsible water steward and develops a water stewardship plan with sufficient leadership support, site authority, and resources allocated. The water stewardship plan should state how stakeholders, including other water users, will be engaged in an open and transparent manner. Step 3 is implement. This is where the steward puts into effect the site's water stewardship plan and improves the impacts of the site, mitigating risks and driving actual improvements in performance. The 5 intended outcomes of water stewardship under the AWS standard are as follows: good water governance, sustainable water balance, good water quality status, important conservation and water-related areas are protected, and WASH, safe water sanitation and hygiene for all. The last 2 steps of the standard are evaluate. Firstly, evaluate performance against the plan and learn. The learning is very important in the process. Learn from the results, both intended and unintended, with the final step being communicate and disclose. Communicate and make available information about the site's stewardship efforts and about progress towards water stewardship more widely. Now, to this point, there have been 261 sites registered and certified in 42 countries. First of all, the site is registered. Then the water steward applies the 5 steps and then goes for certification. 92 sites have been certified. Examples in the UK in the past year are a hospital in Caithness, Scotland, so that's a public institution. Whisky distilleries have been registered in Speyside, Scotland, and a bottled water plant in England has been registered. An important feature of the AWS system is third-party verification. The system provides for independent verification by third-party auditors, leading to certification as evidence of compliance with the rigorous criteria set out in the AWS standard. For businesses, whether SMEs or large companies, and for public authorities whose operations consume substantial volumes of water, certification provides a means of showing that they manage water consciously and well. In other words, certification is a tangible way of demonstrating responsible water management. Now, what are the benefits for water users applying the standard? Well, this will depend on each specific case, but here are some pointers. I mean, most definitely, going through the process of applying the standard increases knowledge and awareness, including of water risks. It can motivate staff, particularly those who have an environmental and social impetus in their work. It can strengthen external stakeholder relationships on the basis that the site owner engages in those actively. It shows responsibility in terms of water management, and thereby it can support the license to operate, and this can apply in the supply chain if sites along the supply chain are used. And the reference on the right to the welcoming of careful drivers in Lancashire is a sort of analogy to the fact that this is what it's all about, isn't it? If a company implements the standard and shows good water stewardship in its operations and down its supply chain, it will be welcome or more welcome in the places in question. And finally, it demonstrates leadership, which is very important, of course, still in this field. And the AWS standard is a process which allows and encourages continual improvement from core level of certification to gold and platinum. So water users who have applied the standard can improve their score against the criteria of the standard. An expert interviewed during the AWS forum recently this year said, faced with shared water challenges, leaders will choose whether they want their company or organization to be on the right side of history in the face of climate change. Now let's look at AWS and CaBA and compare. These are my first thoughts of common characteristics and the fact I think that they are complementary approaches which can work together. So let's first look at the common characteristics. I went through the text on the CaBA website and picked out some key words, and then compared that with key principles and wording under AWS. And you'll see underlined particularly the similarities in terms of the inclusive process, for example, working in catchments, the aim to achieve socially equitable, environmentally sustainable and economically beneficial ends, and the emphasis on water quality, not just water scarcity and quantity. So that seems to me to be some real common characteristics and elements of the two. Now let's just look at how the approaches are slightly different, but I think complementary. CaBA is a civil society-led initiative, according to the website, in England and cross-border Wales, albeit a model that is surely replicable elsewhere. Meanwhile, AWS is applied in England and Wales and globally. As I say, it involves registration certificate of sites and groups of sites which voluntarily undertake to apply the standard. But looking out to the catchment, it's not just about the site, it's looking out to the catchment. A lot of the users of the standard have been private companies, and that's perhaps a particular entry point which compares with CaBA. I'd be interested to hear what you say about that. But other water users applying the standard, I cited a hospital in Scotland, and I've noted that the AWS system provides for third-party verification, which is very important. So thank you for that. I'd be grateful for your thoughts and questions.
Thanks for that, Peter. Assuming you're out there. Oh, look at you, looking very smart.
Thank you very much.
Time, so we're probably going to keep this just to kind of one or two questions. There's a couple of quite specific ones around eutrophication, etc., from Robin, which I think is probably best to pick up offline because that's ultimately about kind of the interventions rather than the AWS process. But I've got two questions, if I may. One is, what's your sense, particularly as I know the AWS forum is still running, in terms of the appetite amongst business to not just adopt the standard, but actually kind of move more into the water stewardship space?
Well, the appetite is good, actually. It's held up very well this year globally. We've had many more sites registered. For example, in Europe, there's been 44 sites registered this year out of 110 total. So that's a good sign. I think in a way we need to catch up in the UK. I mean, Europe, the Europe I just mentioned covers the wider Europe across to Eastern Europe, beyond just the EU. But there's a lot of interest in Europe, particularly the food and beverages sector, but beyond as well. So I think there's appetite, growing appetite, with more realization of the impacts of climate change and how that manifests itself in water. I think in the UK, we have more work to do. And I know you at Rivers Trust and in CaBA have been involved with that. And the purpose really is to look how we could work together, as you have suggested.
Thank you. And one other question that I know has been raised by others is, you gave a very quick overview there of the AWS standards, and I know the actual proper training to properly understand it, to do the standard could be quite lengthy. What or where can people go to get more information about how they can do the AWS training, or at least get a lot more familiar and start to understand the standard?
Well, I think, the first thing to do is download the standard from the AWS website. It's not a long document, it's a 24-page document. It's backed up by a longer guide, but the document itself will show you the principles and then all the criteria and indicators. So you could start with a look at that, and then by all means contact me at AWS, peter@a4ws.org, and I can give you some more information. There are some now electronic tools provided by AWS to help people and to see how the standard looks. There's, under the resources section of the website, there's some case studies of how the standard has been applied in other places. But I think what happens, Alex, is that companies get in touch with us, companies and other water users, and we have a dialogue. As Conor says, as they look at water risks, they come to AWS and think which sites they want to register and pilot use of the AWS standard initially, and then extend that registration across other sites. For example, Diageo has now registered 11 whiskey distilleries in Scotland, and we're all looking for an excuse to go up there, of course.
Well, yes, and sample the wares, no doubt. Right, on that note, and very conscious of time, Peter, I'd like to say big thank you for taking the time to join us today and do your pre-record. But I think it's probably time we pause for a quick, is it 10-15 minute break, Rebecca?
Yeah, so if we come back promptly at 11:30, and we'll have Christine on the reporting on water responsibility and sustainability. So in time for a prompt 11:30 restart.
Brilliant. And just, I know lots of questions have come into the chat and the Q&A. We will try and answer those as we go, but some of us can't talk and type at the same time. So we'll have a look at those during the break. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Okay, welcome back from the break, everybody. I'm going to be picking up the next talk. So let me just share my screen. Okay, so I'm going to give a quick overview of corporate reporting on water responsibility and sustainability, and talk about some of the trends that are relevant to catchment partnerships. I think, most of us don't consider corporate annual reports to be our favorite bedtime reading, but there's really a lot to be learned on how corporates have evolved in relation to sustainability over the years, and where there are some exciting new opportunities for catchment partnerships. I'm singling out an example of a non UK example so that nobody can feel picked on, but this is an old annual report from 2005, very typical of its day. This one's from Anglo American, global mining conglomerate, And what they talk about in the headlines of that report are all of their financial indicators. So how many profit, what their profit margins are, how their operating profit is increasing, how their project pipeline is doing, and a big focus on our favorite fossil fuel, coal. That was very typical of the kind of corporate mindset of its day. So this is not to single them out in particular. Because outside. So the reality of the coal mining situation in many places was then around economic activities. We start seeing a breakdown in relationships of trust with corporates and their different stakeholders. So here we're seeing the aggrieved neighbors in relation to coal mining, particularly in South Africa, and eventually an erosion of what's called the kind of social license to operate from different companies. And that was never really considered and drawn into the mainstream reporting in the olden days, in the 2005 days. But nowadays, there's been a very dramatic shift, particularly in the last 3 to 4 years in corporate reporting. And, it's hard to believe that this is the most recent report from Anglo, where they talk about in their opening statements from the CEO about their purpose, about sustainable mining, never talking about mining without mentioning sustainability, and to be using words like integrity, creativity, and innovation shows that they're very much directing this communication, at their stakeholders and not at their shareholders. So this reflects a lot of the trends that we've seen in the last decade and a half, that the environmental, social, and governance concerns, particularly around climate change and employee engagement, diversity and supply chain management, have really moved up the corporate agenda. And this is very recent commentary taking account of the COVID-19 pandemic as well, which have just served to amplify a lot of these issues and how seriously companies are now taking these. So many companies are now putting purpose before profit, and having that as a key consideration in their feedback, not just to shareholders, but to stakeholders. A group of companies that are very committed to that are the B Corp companies, who actually changed their articles of association to commit to being all about purpose before profit. And a former CEO of Danone, Lorna Davis, is now a B Corp ambassador. And she talks about this being the age of radical interdependency, so that businesses have to shift to be about purpose before profit. And what's more, that in their broader activities, they can't go it alone. But the social partnerships and partnerships around sustainability are really critical as we're facing a lot of global and systemic challenges. Of course, the B Corp companies are not the only ones that prioritize purpose, but they are the ones who've now legally hardwired it into their mission statement as businesses. So I think some of the kind of core changes that we've seen very much reflect also the change that many of us come from a science background. And, we started off 25 years ago with a view of sustainability of these 3 overlapping circles, and sustainable development was quite a small proportion where the different areas of society, environment, and economy overlapped. Now that paradigm has shifted to appreciating that the economy only exists within society and society only exists within a healthy environment. There's at no point at which the economy exists outside of those. So this is similarly picked up in the kind of reporting trends that we've seen, that the ESG issues have really evolved from being something that often referred to a project on the outside, something that sits on the outside of the company, to something that has been drawn in. And the best cases show this strong internalization of sustainability and ESG values. That's partly as a result of investors pressurizing from the outside and changing legislation around pollution, sustainability, and carbon emissions, but also as a result of internal factors. So millennial workforce, and thank you millennials for doing better than my generation, have pushed to have these issues taken much more seriously within companies. So communicating a clear purpose has become very critical for companies that want to do well and remain resilient. We can also see that the top ESG ranked companies, so those that really are prioritizing the sustainability issues, on the whole, this is from 2014, are performing 10% better than the kind of broad benchmark of top Standard & Poor's 500 companies. So it's resulting in a financial dividend as well as a social dividend. So it's both for investors and for broader stakeholders in society. So what does all of this mean in terms of water stewardship? And where can we see water stewardship and the journey that corporates are taking in many cases reflected in their annual reports? For those companies that are starting off their water stewardship journey and they're becoming water aware, they will have identified water as a material issue, and it will be communicated as a risk and as a concern. But maybe not yet got to the next stage of starting to quantify that risk. So maybe not yet using the water risk filter that Conor showed us earlier, or starting to think about TCFD, which I'm going to come to in a minute. As they commit to internal action, they'll start setting water efficiency targets, reporting on these, committing to standards like AWS and other standards, and minimizing impact. And then as they start moving to having got their own house in order, moving towards collective action, there'll be a commitment to external partnerships to start focusing on building resilience in the full value chain. And finally, at the sort of the pinnacle of the water stewardship journey, where there's an influence on governance, and I always want to prefix that with an influence on good governance, there will be discussions around the engagement in sector-wide commitments and advocacy. So the kind of commitments that we've seen that Alex talked about earlier with the Courtauld Commitment, that will start becoming more prominent in the reporting. Now, we're all catchment practitioners and very focused on water. And we have to keep in mind that actually companies are much more focused on climate action and the kind of broader response around the climate crisis rather than water as a singular activity. It was only, I think, last week or 2 weeks ago that we heard about the net zero commitments for the water sector in the UK. Obviously, there's the strong race to zero, reducing emissions as part of climate mitigation. And COP26 will be held in Glasgow next year, so there will be a huge focus from UK companies on the climate debate, and particularly around mitigation of climate action. But in addition to mitigation, there's the response and adaptation to climate change, and we already know that we're locked into probably at least a 2-degree climate change. So it's starting to, companies are starting to look at how is climate change going to impact them. They're reporting on their emissions, their greenhouse gas emissions, and committing to reducing those with time, aiming for net zero. And at the same time, they're now having to start reporting on how are they going to be impacted by the inevitable climate change? And of course, much of that brings water firmly onto their radar and at the center of their agenda. So there's something new that's happening in corporate reporting, which is rather clumsily called TCFD, which stands for the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures. And we've seen some companies already starting to talk about that even in their 2019 annual reports, including water companies. And by 2022, this is going to be mandatory. So companies are really starting to give a much more quantified risk approach to how climate change is going to impact them through droughts, through floods, through extreme weather events, and how it's going to impact their supply chains. And I think one report that just came out in the last month that summarizes the relevance of this for the kind of work that we're doing in catchment partnerships is this Rising to Resilience report produced by WWF and Coca-Cola. And it really emphasizes that in looking at climate risk, and trying to build resilience into supply chains and whole value chains, that local solutions, this step 3 that's given here, implementing local solutions that are nature friendly, responsive and flexible, are really critical to managing those climate risks in the long term. So as companies are starting to have to put numbers in pounds and pence to how they're going to be impacted by climate change, they're starting to look at different scenarios, not just the different scenarios of climate scenarios, but different scenarios of engagement with stakeholders and other partners in order to try and mitigate that risk. And that gives catchment partnerships a big opportunity. So as we've shifted from the kind of extractive, that kind of bad old age of just taking resources out of the environment and towards a more regenerative age where companies are focused much more on their purpose and how they can be part of a global regeneration, particularly of our natural resources. Water's being identified increasingly as a material issue linked to climate and pollution. So it's appearing on the corporate radar, it's getting the CEO's attention. But climate remains the big issue. That of course incorporates water. Water is not the big issue standing alone. Climate is, but the partnerships that we're working with help with both mitigation and adaptation. So they can be really important. And the fact that catchment partnerships are community-based and locally led means that they help to regenerate both social and natural capital. They're going to be really critical in terms of embedding resilience into supply chain landscapes, and corporates are really interested in this at the moment. So I think there's a broad acceptance that we need to accelerate this transformation together. And just to sum up some of these trends that we've seen in the last decade and a half in the way that corporates report on their own position in the world, and it also reflects the way that they see the world differently. We've seen this shift towards internalization. Sustainability is now part of us. It's not something that we do on the outside. It's also core to our purpose and our identity. It's about who we are. And it's being treated in a much more integrated way alongside financial reporting. It's not just seen as an add-on, it's part of why we're here. We've got a much clearer level of accountability in terms of committing to metrics through standards such as the Alliance for Water Stewardship. So corporates are prepared to be judged by the metrics that they set for themselves and meet, and also by the friends that they keep and the partnerships they establish to address this. That's it from me. Thank you.
Thanks, Christine. We are starting to get some questions, although please feel free to type in more. We'll get through as many as we can in the next couple of minutes. Peter Taylor has said, in the 1990s, a lot of businesses involved in CSR were shown to spend a lot more on their PR and their comms than on the actual measures. And he says, I think you may have touched on this, but can businesses involved in water stewardship show the breakdown of their spend, which is obviously a good indicator of their real intent?
I think that's a really good point. The kind of metrics that are normally put in place, and we'll see Rylan's presentation just now about science-based targets. I don't think that financial commitments linked to those have really been considered. I haven't seen finances reported on, and it's a good point that, you know, the kind of PR definitely got a larger budget. And in fact, there are still many companies for whom, you know, the money that goes into partnerships comes out of a marketing budget. It doesn't come out of a kind of core business budget. So yeah, it's a good point, and I think that's a good challenge to maybe place back to the corporates as well, when they might start looking at sharing those investment numbers.
Okay, can't see any other questions coming in at the moment, so might just give it another few seconds before we do go over to Rylan's presentation. Otherwise, Christine still has the ability to look at the Q&A, so don't worry if you don't get it in on time. So yeah, let's go over to Rylan Dobson from WWF on science-based water targets. As we said earlier, Rylan is based in Canada, so he's not going to be available for the Q&A himself, but if you do have questions, the three of us will do our best, well, Alex and Christine will do their best to answer them, so I'll line up that presentation now.
Hi, good morning, everyone. My name is Rylan Dobson. I'm the Water Stewardship Manager hosted out of WWF-Germany. Apologies that I can't be with you today. It's currently the early hours of the morning for me. I'm based in Vancouver, but it's great to be talking to you today, if this is recorded. And what I'm going to cover today is a little bit of a whistle-stop tour with respect to how this idea of science-based target is starting to permeate into corporate performance targets, and then also how this has potential implications for practitioners who work at a catchment level. So what we're going to go through is and explore four main sort of concepts. First of all, is setting a little bit of a scene with respect to planetary boundaries and science. The next is to look at sort of how this then applies to corporate targets. Then looking at a little bit of a conceptual model for science-based target and what that might look like, and then some implementation considerations for practitioners who are sort of working at a catchment level. First of all, we need to just firstly deal with some terminology. So some of you might have heard the term context-based targets being flown around within the corporate space. Now, this is just to note that the term context-based was the first term that we started to use as this idea of linking science to corporate water performance a couple of years ago. That's now then sort of merged or sort of evolved into science-based. And so really the key message is, if you are hearing corporates talk about context-based water targets, simply they are referring to science-based targets, or they should be referring to science-based targets. The other term that you probably will hear is this idea of contextual targets, and we'll talk a little bit about that. But contextual targets, just to say, are different from science-based targets. So first, we're going to dive a little bit into sort of some of the background in terms of planetary boundaries and this idea of science. And we need to then cast our minds back to 2009 with the introduction of the Planetary Boundaries Framework by Johan Rockström. And what this framework sort of put forward was this idea that the stability of our planet is really sort of revolves around 9 key systems, environmental systems. And each of these systems has the ability to absorb a certain amount of impact from human uses. And so this idea that, certainly from a water perspective, is that there's only so much water, and we can use water to a point before sort of systems and the processes within water, like biodiversity, start to become impacted by that. Then in 2012, Kate Raworth introduced the social donut model, which essentially added a social layer to the planetary boundaries framework, setting out a level of minimum requirements with respect to what humans need in order to thrive. And so in combination, the planetary boundaries sets this upper limit of the amount of sort of impact we can impart on a system, whereas Kate's model then proposes a minimum requirement that's needed. So from a quantity point of view, that might be the amount of a certain amount of drinking water that a person needs in order to remain healthy. So how then do we start applying these two models to the corporate performance targets? What we also saw at the same time as these models that were kind of put forward is we started to see, we have been seeing a shifting narrative with respect to how corporates have been viewing their place in creating value. Cast our minds back 10 years or so, the predominant view is very much a state shareholder view, where sort of, value creation, a company existed to create value for its shareholders and no one else. This has then kind of merged into this triple bottom line thinking, which is a little bit more of a balanced sort of value creation approach. And what we're seeing now is this sort of even that triple bottom line moving on to sort of a more systems view. And what I mean by systems view is if we then look at something like Porter's 5 forces model, which looks at the sort of forces that drives corporate strategy, we're starting to see things like environmental resilience and social resilience starting to be brought into the things that are needed to be addressed within corporate strategy in order to make a company resilient. How does this all then sort of fit together? So essentially, in combination, all these factors are starting to move the strategic narrative within companies away from answering a question of what could we do. So, we're being a nice corporate citizen. What are the things we could do to contribute? Much more to actually these systems present a real resilience risk to us as a business. Resource scarcity presents a real risk. And so what do we have to do? What must we do in order to survive as a business? Where this took us for water is, taking that planetary boundaries sort of model, we then came up against COP21 in 2015, and we saw the emergence of science-based targets, the Science-Based Targets Initiative for climate. And the natural question was, well, how do we then start applying this idea of science to water? And the early kind of play in the space was a paper that was jointly developed around this idea of exploring the case for context-based water targets. That subsequently kind of moved on, and we're now in a position where there's a more formalized science-based target network that has been set up to handle this. So within the Science-Based Target Network, the Science-Based Target Network is essentially an idea of how do we take that idea of science-based targets for climate and push it further into other issues, so biodiversity, oceans, land, water. And there's a water hub that sits within that, and these are organizations that are currently leading that. And the hub is currently working on developing a specific methodology that will allow a corporate to implement this idea of science into their performance targets. And we're not expecting to see a methodology being ready for corporate use until at least the end of 2021. So again, just a little bit of a flag that if people are talking about a science-based approach, there is no methodology that is available. So what is kind of science, and how does this relate to corporate targets? Now, if we kind of put this not science on one side and sort of science on a spectrum, essentially there's two elements that are starting to be changed here. One is performance. And so as we start moving towards science, we're seeing the performance of a corporate target being more and more linked to science. We're also seeing the coverage of targets changing. And so from, not science-based, a very broad range of types of targets. So there might be quantity, quality, wash, for instance. But as we move towards science, we're using that sort of external context and what's actually happening in a basin to inform what targets are actually being focused on. What we can then do is we can almost then start to create some sort of typologies of targets. And what's being kind of discussed and talked about at the moment is three. So business as usual, which is practically any corporate target that you see now on water. Then a more middle ground, which is being referred to as contextual, and then science-based, sort of on the far end. And really kind of this idea and differentiation between contextual and science-based is contextual is starting to move a company away from sort of a blanket approach to water targets to start setting water targets that are much more informed by the local context. And so starting to at least mirror what the water issues are. So again, if there's scarcity in a basin, you're prioritizing setting efficiency targets, and that efficiency target that you're setting is starting to be informed by the scarcity level. So again, it's not directly linked, but it's starting to move in that direction. Just in terms of where certainly WWF sees a lot of this space emerging, as we are seeing this, the methodology being developed, is we're going to see this gradual shift away from business as usual over time towards taking a more science-based approach. Now, what's involved in a science-based target for water? Now, this, as the methodology is still emerging, it's hard to say exactly what's going to be in the methodology, but to kind of give some sort of tangible example, this was a diagram that we put forward in that original sort of exploring the case for context-based water targets. And it's very much a quantity example, but it gives you a sense of the types of elements that are going to need to be considered when going through setting a science-based target. And essentially, we need to, first of all, know how much water is in the system. And then once we know what water is in the system or what water is available, there's different uses of this water. So terrestrial ecosystems need water, the plants need water in a basin. Freshwater biodiversity needs a certain amount of water to survive. Humans in that space need a certain amount of water to live. And then we get into this further sort of what's remaining then becomes sort of how do we then divvy up this remaining water for sort of an economic and social allocation. And within that, you get the corporate sort of water use and allocation. So there's different elements to this that a company is going to have to go through in order to really define, the different components. And certainly science is starting to ask the question of what amount of water is needed from the system to allow, plants to survive, to allow natural biodiversity to thrive. Lastly, I just want to touch on sort of some implementation considerations because there's a few here, and these what I'm going to talk through now are primarily sort of some of the views of WWF as we've seen them through some of our piloting of science-based targets with corporates. First of all is accessibility to hydrological data. We can never have too much hydrological data, but as we know, often the data is not necessarily readily available. And so we're now kind of, essentially asking companies to not just sort of at a corporate level, but at a facility by facility level, start to understand the specific hydrological context in which they're operating. So all those different components that I kind of showed you on the previous slides, we're going to need data to kind of really show exactly what's happening. So we're going to need things like environmental flows. We're going to need precipitation data. We're going to need sort of plants and vegetative cover data. The other thing that's going to start potentially hampering things is within climate, we've got this sort of socially agreed 1.5 degree sort of scenario, but there isn't the equivalent for water, because the value of water is very different for different stakeholders. And so at some point we're going to need to come to some sort of agreement as what do we collectively believe is a sustainable level of water use, for instance. And again, that's a quantity example for this particular basin. What does science say? The third element is this regulatory and science allocation of water. So there may be a clash between sort of what is currently how water is allocated under regulatory sort of regimes versus what comes out of this question of what a science actually sort of requires, sort of what do these different components need. So there's going to need to be some sort of reconciliation between those two components. The last one is more of an opportunity, but really sort of there's this opportunity now to much more directly connect business performance and priorities with catchment sort of performance and priorities. And so much stronger alignment between the connection between how corporate performance on water is specifically contributing to positive outcomes at a basin level. And flowing through kind of really all these elements is this idea that there needs to be some sort of common platform for these companies to engage in with respect to setting the science-based target, because each company within a catchment can really go and collect their own data, can piece these data points together. They can create their own 1.5 degree scenario, they can create their own allocation approach. But ultimately, there's an opportunity, if we can sort of align this and create a foundation and platform that puts all these pieces in place, that makes it easy for companies to set these targets, we then get greater alignment between that last point of connecting business and catchment priorities. So I'm going to leave it there, but there are all my details. Feel free to get in touch with me. But that was, again, really a whistle-stop tour of how this idea of science-based thinking is starting to permeate into corporate performance targets and the potential implications for practitioners such as yourselves who are working at a catchment level. Thank you very much.
Okay, hope everyone enjoyed Rylan's presentation there. I thought that was really interesting. So if I bring us all back, we'll see if we can answer any questions that have been sent to Rylan.
Well, I'm just seeing some really useful comments about it as opposed to questions. And I think one of the questions that Rylan himself posed about, how do we agree on science-based targets at a catchment level that are not just science-based, but also taking account of the regulatory regimes, makes me think about how, we might be already a step ahead of the game in the UK with our CaBA partnerships and the kind of wealth of data and evidence that they hold. I think it could be a useful future application for the CaBA partnerships. I'm looking at Alex on my screen here for if he's got any comment on that as well.
No, I think you're right. This is an evolving landscape of theory. I think the science-based targets approach in terms of perhaps a business interest versus, I hate to say the term, natural capital accounting in the UK, and I think there at some point when both become a little bit more mature and sophisticated, and potentially through the likes of the CaBA data sets and the catchment plans, etc., you might be in a position to kind of start to really define what those targets are. And going back to, I think, one of the questions raised by Robin earlier on, what might the wider catchment benefits be? But I think we're probably a way off that yet in terms of defined metrics and consistency.
Yeah, and I know that everybody always thinks that their own discipline is special and more complicated than anybody else's, but you know, I think when one compares water with carbon, you know, a litre of water is not a litre of water wherever it is on the planet, whereas a kilogram of carbon in the atmosphere is a kilogram of carbon. So in the case of water, it is much more complicated. We're bound to say that. But I'm also have a bit of a concern that the methodology doesn't tie itself up in knots and become too difficult to ever implement, because on carbon, we're seeing this absolute race to zero and an acceleration of efforts. And I just don't want water to get stuck in the mud of its own kind of complicated calculations about what we need to do. Let's, you know, start doing something first.
Yeah. There is a comment here from Steve Brown. I don't know if either of you want to respond. So Steve said, I like the idea of a 1.5 degrees C equivalence for water, however, not entirely sure what that might look like. If either of you want to jump in on that.
Yeah, I think I agree with him. It would be great if we could have a kind of sort of blanket outcome target. But again, it's tricky to know unless we're looking at sort of natural baselines, what that might look like for catchment health more broadly and water targets specifically.
Great. Okay. It's almost 10 past, so I'm going to bring in Kat and get her talk loaded up for the next session on water disclosure under CDP. So, oh yeah, Kat's appearing, which is perfect. Let's get that presentation up.
Hi, my name is Catherine Moncrieff and I'm in the water security team at CDP. So I'm going to talk through what CDP corporate disclosure is and how this catalyses water stewardship and protects the water environment. I'll also talk through how CDP data is used, and finally we'll take a peek at the 2020 data that's just come through to see how UK companies are faring against key water stewardship indicators. So let's start with a bit of an intro to CDP. CDP's mission is to focus investors, companies and cities on taking urgent action to build a sustainable economy. And it does this by measuring and understanding their environmental impact. CDP runs the global disclosure system that enables companies and cities to measure and manage their environmental impacts. This means that we have the world's most comprehensive collection of self-reported data on environmental impact. This disclosure system aligns with the various reporting standards, and it therefore represents a gold standard in terms of environmental reporting. CDP has a huge network of investors, purchasing companies, and policymakers around the globe who use our data and insights to make better informed decisions. So how does CDP disclosure work? So CDP works with over 500 investors to request the world's largest publicly listed companies to disclose information on climate change, deforestation, and water security. These investors represent more than $100 trillion in assets. We also work with over 150 purchasing companies to request information from global suppliers, and that's a supply chain request. Requested companies then disclose information on climate change, deforestation, and water security through 3 separate questionnaires. This includes information on impacts, risks, responses, and strategies. This information is then used by investors and purchasing companies to make informed decisions, hold companies to account, reward companies with superior performance, and ultimately drive action to reduce environmental impact. So today I'll be zooming in on the water security questionnaire. But before I do that, I just want to flag that what I've described here is our corporate disclosure platform. We also have a separate program for cities, which encourages local government authorities to disclose. So I'm not going to dive into that today, but very happy to do another time if there's interest. So this slide is the basic framework of the Water Security Questionnaire. As you can see, it's split into 10 modules, which provide a logical framework for action on water stewardship. The framework broadly reflects the narrative of the CEO Water Mandate Corporate Reporting Guidelines. This framework allows companies to better understand the water security journey they're on and tell their investors or their customers about it. So completing the questionnaire helps companies to think through how they are dependent on water, how they are exposed to water risks and opportunities, and how they might respond to these risks and opportunities, and therefore support action to reduce their impact on the water environment, both within the company and with stakeholders in the catchments where they operate. Most importantly, the questionnaire helps drive the integration of water issues into the heart of the business, so into its governance and strategy. So the next few slides show you some of the detail contained within the various modules. The current state module focuses on water accounting, so withdrawals or abstraction and wastewater discharges. It also focuses on how companies are engaging with their value chains. The business impacts module is where companies report water-related impacts such as supply chain disruption, increased production costs, fines or penalties relating to breaches in regulations. The risks and opportunities module is where companies detail which of their facilities are exposed to what sort of water risks and how these risks might impact business revenue or value at risk. It also asks companies to report how they are responding to particular risks and associated investments. It provides a list of hotspot river basins, and that's really useful to data users. So many companies disclosing through CDP use tools such as WWF's Water Risk Filter to help fill out this section. The opportunities question informs data users how the company is realizing significant market opportunities and their potential financial value. Module W5 is where companies report water accounting data at the facility level, and investors are increasingly keen to have data at this granularity. In the governance module, companies report whether they have a publicly available water policy. The questionnaire also asks about board-level oversight and senior management level responsibility of water issues. And this is really important for demonstrating that water issues are being taken seriously at the highest level in the business. The business strategy module brings a forward-looking focus to the water security questionnaire. Companies are asked to record how water-related issues have been integrated into business objectives, business strategy, and long-term financial planning. The scenario analysis questions ask about the company's use of climate-related scenario analysis, and this responds to one of the key recommendations of the TCFD. W8 on targets is also an important module. So here, companies share their level of ambition with stakeholders and track progress against these. We will be revising this section as guidance on science-based water targets evolves, as described by Rylan. CDP is also heavily involved in this initiative. This slide gives an overview of some of the benefits to companies of disclosing on water issues through CDP's water questionnaire. So firstly, the water questionnaire helps companies to manage and take action on their water risks. It also reduces reporting burden because companies can report in one place, yet reach lots of different stakeholders. It also enables companies to meet investor demand for transparency on water risks. And it allows purchasing companies to turn the spotlight on their supply chain, so to better understand risks and engage with their suppliers accordingly. The questionnaire also facilitates the transparency required to improve reputation on water issues. And this is particularly important with increasing competition for water, environmental degradation hitting the headlines, and also consumers being more and more aware of the pollution potential of the products that they buy. So companies need to be more transparent than ever if they're to maintain their social license to operate and also maintain their sales. Finally, CDP scores companies according to their responses, providing a holistic measure on corporate water stewardship. This enables companies to benchmark themselves against industry peers, driving action. So you'll see that 2 of these points are highlighted in red, and I'm going to dive into these in a bit more detail to demonstrate how CDP data is used. So the first point that I want to pick up is that by reporting through CDP, companies disclose standardized, comparable data in one place, and this data is then used by a range of different organizations. So this diagram maps just some of the organizations that use CDP water data to protect the water environment. So as well as the finance and business community, it is used by policymakers, civil society, and academic institutions. This data is used to drive the better decision-making that is necessary to transition to a water-secure economy, protect the water environment, and ultimately achieve SDG 6, which is water security for all. So, for example, CDP water data is used across the finance community. It feeds into several sustainability rankings and tools, and as such, it informs investor portfolio analysis and investment decisions. So I'm going to talk about this in a bit more detail on the next slide. Meanwhile, large purchasing companies use CDP data to assess suppliers' environmental performance on water. Another example is governments using CDP data to inform environmental policies and regulations relating to businesses. Catchment partnerships could use CDP data to identify businesses within their catchments, which they could work with to address particular water issues. So let's look into how investors are using data disclosed through CDP. The slide shows how water issues can affect company value and investor returns. So in 2019, companies reported through CDP that up to $425 billion of business revenue was at risk because of water issues. And this is likely to be an underestimate. Investors are increasingly seeing how water issues are translating into financial impacts. So they're using detailed data from CDP about how companies are managing water issues. It enables them to assess the risk exposure of their portfolios, make informed investment decisions, ensure companies are addressing water issues appropriately, and ultimately drive action on water stewardship. CDP's data is currently shared with over 500 investors. Given that investors have enormous influence over how companies choose to grow and transform, this flow of data is enormously powerful. I'm now going to give you a very brief peek at the data disclosed by companies in 2020. The data sets have only just been cleaned and analysed, so this is hot off the press. So this map shows the number of companies disclosing in each country in 2020. We had 93 companies disclosing in the UK. This pie chart shows the sector split of the 93 UK companies that disclosed. The largest sector disclosing was materials, followed by manufacturing and then retail. Note that the retail sector encompasses sectors such as food and beverage and apparel within its supply chain. These bar charts show the percentage of responding companies that are monitoring abstraction and discharge quality at more than 3/4 of their facilities, so abstractions on the left and discharge quality on the right. It shows how UK companies compare to the global and European averages. It indicates that UK companies are potentially lagging behind on monitoring the quality of their discharges. These charts show the percentage of responding companies that are setting targets on reducing abstraction and reducing pollution. The targets are really important for crystallising ambition and driving action. So it looks like UK companies are leading the way when it comes to abstraction, but potentially falling behind on pollution targets. Given that CDP only asks those companies in high impact sectors to respond to the questionnaire, and water pollution is a growing problem, we should really be seeing almost all companies setting targets for pollution reduction across the globe. So this is my final graph of stats. It gives a flavour for some of the other key performance indicators measured through our questionnaire. It's good to see a majority of companies undertaking risk assessments which take account of the water availability in the catchments where they operate. Under governance, we look for companies that are rewarding their C-suite employees for performance on water. This is considered a leadership behaviour in our scoring. Value chain engagement is an area in which we are also focusing, and it's good to see UK companies leading here. However, this should be closer to 100% across the board. Most water impacts and risks manifest themselves in the supply chain, so companies need to do better at tying procurement criteria to water stewardship performance. Hundreds of data points are measured through the CDP Water Security Questionnaire, and the responses include lots of really valuable qualitative data where companies tell us about their responses to water risks and the detail of their ambitions. So what I've shown you is really just the very tip of the iceberg. So please do get in touch if you would like more information. You can download up to 20 corporate responses from our website without any cost or data sharing agreement. So thanks for your time today, and I look forward to your questions.
Wow. Thank you very much for that, Kat. That was brilliant. And very nice to see you again. Hope all is well. We'll just wait for some questions to come in, but whilst they start to come in from the panel, I've got a couple myself, if I may.
Sure.
The first is, from a CDP perspective, do you think actually the prominence of your reporting is becoming more or less important to investors? And have you seen any, kind of sparing blushes, any examples of where your reporting might have had a kind of impact in terms of investment decisions for a business?
Yeah, sure. So it's definitely becoming more important to investors. So every year we have more investor signatories, and our investor signatories are those investors that request companies to disclose on sort of our behalf. So we've seen a rise in investor signatories. There's also been a rise in companies disclosing on water as well, year on year. So we're now up to nearly 3,000 companies that are disclosing on water. And investors are increasingly getting in touch with us, asking questions about water. So we've had a number of different investors, very big ones, coming to us this year. And it was really good to see BlackRock. So I think BlackRock's the biggest investor in the world, over $1 trillion worth of assets. And they released a report in the summer about, it was called Troubled Waters, and it was about the importance of water risk and how that was manifesting as an issue for investors. So that was really great to see. We've been working quite closely with NBIM, which is another massive investor. So they basically they manage Norway's sovereign wealth fund, which is huge. We have been working with them quite closely over a number of years, and they're one of the investors that use our data. They do their own scoring, and they use their data, and they use that scoring to assess their portfolios. And as a result of our work with them, they've actually updated their investment policies. So it now very much has water at the center, and it includes pollution as well, which is really great.
Brilliant, well done. And just one other question from me. I don't think we've had any come in from the panel. I think you've probably kind of blown them all away a bit, to be honest. You mentioned about how catchment partnerships could start to understand which of those companies are disclosing and how that might relate to their catchments. How do they get that information? Where is that available? Is this part of this 20 that you're able to download free of charge?
Yeah, so you can go on to our website and get the data. I can send you the link in a moment, and it should just all work and be there. If there's a catchment partnership that finds that they want a lot of the data, more than 20, then we can work out some kind of data sharing arrangement. We do have that with some NGOs, including WWF.
Okay, be careful what you wish for there. I get overrun, but yeah. Yeah.
But it's, the big companies have agreed for their data to be shared publicly. So, it is publicly available. We have to put a limit on it, just because a lot of work goes into the data that we create. And so, we have to put some kind of value on it. So we usually ask investors to become signatories, those investors that are using it, or companies to become members to see other data as well.
Brilliant. I am going to call it to a close there, because we're, as always, massively over time. But again, thank you very much for your sharing your insights and thoughts with everyone today. I think it's been a revelation to many, and well done. Keep up the good work.
Nice to see you and be part of this, and do get in touch. I realise what I've talked about today is looking at things from quite a different angle, looking at the investor perspective, but it's really, really important. Investors have a huge amount of power in this space. So yeah.
Brilliant.
Thank you.
Thank you. I'm going to hand back over to Becca now, just to tee up the next session, if that's okay.
Yep, sure. So I am just doing a little bit of shuffling, and then we will be ready to share Ariane's video.
Good day, everyone. My name is Ariane Laporte-Bisquit. I am the Water Stewardship Project Manager based at WWF-Germany in Berlin. In today's presentation, I'll be introducing you to WWF's flagship tool, the Water Risk Filter, and in particular, diving into the recently launched new TCFD aligned scenarios to help financial institutions and companies better understand and prepare to future water risks in the face of climate change and socioeconomic changes. First of all, for those of you who maybe are not so familiar with the WWF Water Risk Filter tool, just as a bit of background, it's really a free, practical online tool designed to be used by companies and financial institutions to help them assess and respond and value their water risks. And here is just an overview on this diagram of the different functionalities of the tool. Now, since the tool was launched in 2012, it is at its core a practical tool to enable companies and financial institutions to assess their water risks at a global scale. But as you would have heard from my colleague earlier today, Conor, we also have higher resolution local data sets for specific regions and countries, such as for the UK, in order to enable for a finer scale assessment using best available national data sets. But the tool has expanded over the years from being a risk assessment tool to also providing recommendations. And in 2019, we developed a new section called the response section, which enables to provide recommended response actions to identified water risks, therefore guiding users from risk to contextual response actions. And now, with the new functionality launched in October of our new water risk filter scenarios, users can now explore forward-looking scenarios as recommended by the Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosure, TCFD, to better understand and manage future water risks in the face of climate and socioeconomic changes. And whilst I'll be focusing this webinar very much on the new water risk filter scenarios, I also did want to quickly, briefly flag to you an exciting new and upcoming feature to watch out for in 2021, which is a new valuation tool being developed in collaboration with Water Foundry and powered by CDP data in order to help estimate financial impacts from water risk, which will help companies better disclose on financial exposure as recommended by TCFD. And for a bit of background also, to those of you who want to understand a bit what's the importance for companies and investors to apply scenario analysis in the context of climate and water. Well, given the high uncertainties and high potential impacts of climate change, it was one of the key recommendations by the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosure, TCFD, for corporates and investors to conduct scenario analysis in order to help them identify future climate risks and opportunities, and in turn appropriately incorporate and account for this into their planning processes and strategic decisions. Now, in essence, scenario analysis is a method to manage uncertainties and therefore a useful and powerful tool for forward-looking assessments of potential future risks and opportunities so that businesses can evaluate their resilience under different possible futures. And as you're aware, climate and water risk are closely interlinked, and therefore it is really critical for TCFD scenario analysis to look at climate, but also incorporate water in a comprehensive manner. However, the application of scenario analysis to both climate and water in a business context is relatively new. There's not a lot of tools available for comprehensive scenario analysis of water risks in particular, which can be easily used. And so for this reason, we decided to develop scenarios of water risks based on climate and socioeconomic changes in line with the TCFD recommendations, and to then integrate it into the water risk filter tool to enable companies and investors to evaluate future water risk and help inform resilience planning. And when we developed the water risk filter scenarios, we aimed to apply the same approach as for the tool's current risk assessment framework by integrating 2030 and 2050 quantitative projections covering all types of corporate water risk. As you can see here illustrated in this diagram, the water risk filter scenarios have a comprehensive coverage of water risk, ranging from TCFD-focused acute physical risks such as flooding, to also the TCFD-focused chronic physical risks such as scarcity, water quality, and ecosystem service degradation. But we also cover with our water risk scenarios the less commonly explored regulatory and reputational water risk, which can cause significant potential impacts if overlooked. And therefore, the water risk filter scenarios are aimed to provide a comprehensive overview of how different types of water risks may evolve in the medium to long term. And to achieve this comprehensive coverage of water risk, we actually collaborated with multiple research groups, as listed here in this diagram, with expertise in each of the different aspects of water risks. And I really want to emphasize that we, WWF, did not develop ourselves any models, but rather collaborated with these different research groups and compiled all these different scientific and peer-reviewed global data sets of different aspects of water risks together, and we translated this into our risk assessment framework and into the water risk filter tools so that companies and financial institutions can easily use and apply it across their portfolio to understand their water risk exposure under different scenarios. So in line with the TCFD recommendation, the water resilient scenarios are based on a combination of most relevant climate scenarios by IPCC representative concentration pathways, RCPs, and socioeconomic scenarios developed by IASA with their shared socioeconomic pathways, SSP. But accordingly, so we developed then these 3 pathways for the water resilient scenarios, following the respective narratives as summarized in this diagram, ranging from a optimistic scenario, which represents a world with sustainable socioeconomic development and ambitious reductions of greenhouse gas emissions, leading to an increase in temperature of approximately 1.5 degrees by the end of the 21st century. The current trend scenario represents a world similar to current socioeconomic developments and leading to an increase in temperature of approximately 2 degrees by the end of the 21st century. And finally, we have also a pessimistic scenario representing a world with unequal and unstable socioeconomic development and high greenhouse gas emission levels, leading to an increase in temperatures of approximately 3.5 to 4 degrees by the end of the 21st century. And so really, with the water resilient scenarios, users can start to explore how water risk will evolve in different ways over time under these different scenario pathways I've just described. And so after years of development of the water resilient scenarios, we launched them online in the Water Resilient tool in early October this year. On the water resilient scenarios page, as you can see here, you can click and explore visually to see how different water risk maps, in order to understand how different types of water risk in 2030 and 2050 could potentially look like and how risk levels may change under 3 different scenario pathways ranging from optimistic to current and pessimistic pathway, as I've described. Whilst the water resilient scenarios use global data sets, you can obviously zoom in into a specific region or country of interest, as well as water risk of interest. As for example, here, we can explore in more details future flood risks in the UK under a pessimistic scenario. For example, here I'm looking at 2030, but also in 2050 as an example. And we have many corporate partners that we work with closely, already using the Water Resilient tool to guide them on their water stewardship journey. But when we were developing the Water Resilient scenarios, we had the chance to test out and apply the scenarios with some of our specific corporate partners to explore future water risk across their operations and supply chains. And so here in particular, I've highlighted, we worked with Carlsberg, as well as the German food retailer Edeka, as well as the biopharmaceutical company AstraZeneca to test out the water resilient scenarios. And now with the water resilient scenarios online, we're having more and more conversations with many other companies interested to apply them. But to give you a practical example here, it's a fictional example of the application of the water resilient scenarios to a company's operations, and or it could be their supplier sites across the globe, which is how the water resilient is mainly meant to be used as a screening tool, but you can, of course, focus your analysis on the specific region of the world of interest. And based on information on the location of sites and materiality, we are able then to map all sites, and then this can help screen and identify most material water risk hotspots, which are illustrated on the maps by here by sites exposed to higher water risk, represented in darker orange to red, and the size of the dots representing the materiality lens. And so through this exercise, companies are able to start understanding where their most material water risk exposure and where they need to then concentrate their efforts or engagement with particular suppliers most material exposed to water risks. Moreover, for every single site, we can go even further to understand how water risk will evolve over time at a specific location. As for example, here in this graphic, it's focusing on one of the sites in the UK. It's showing the evolution of water risk. And really, it is important to identify the most material sites exposed to face the greatest increase in risk, as those are likely to also face the greatest challenge for adaptation, and therefore will require greater resilience efforts to be put in place. And whilst this example I'm showing overall water risk exposure, which aggregates physical, regulatory, and reputational risk all together, we can create maps and analysis more specifically looking at different types of water risks, ranging from the physical, such as floods or scarcity, but also regulatory and reputational risks more specifically. And moreover, whether at a portfolio or at a site level, we can also get an overview of what are the different drivers or change that are the most relevant, and therefore you should be starting to focus your attention most to address with regards to the type of response actions you put in place as a company. And this will vary according to the location of the site, obviously across the globe, but also under the different scenario pathways. In this example here, under a current trend pathway, this diagram shows the different categories of physical, regulatory, and reputational risks. And you can see in that lighter yellow shade the current risk exposure of today, and in the darker shade shows the increase in risk for 2030 and 2050. In a similar way, you can start to also understand drivers of change under an optimistic but also a pessimistic scenario. And so in this particular fictional example, you can see that physical water scarcity risk of today is low and is projected to increase a little in the future under the current trend and pessimistic scenario, whereas regulatory risks are projected to increase quite a lot in the future, in particular under a pessimistic scenario. And after some practical examples there that I've just given you on the water risk filter scenarios application for a company to understand their water risks and materiality, here is a high-level 4-step process overview to illustrate how companies can leverage the water risk filter tool to turn risk into resilience. And so the first step is to assess current water risk. And it's important to note that establishing a baseline of current risk exposure and responses is a critical first step. Then, as a second step, companies should start to use the water risk scenarios to assess exposure to future water risks and understand how different types of water risk may evolve over time, as well as identify the key drivers of change and identify which most material sites will face the greatest increase in terms of risk to focus attention and efforts. But the outputs of the water risk filter scenarios should really be used to then evaluate whether the company's current strategy and response actions are adequately, or whether they're adequate resilience considering future risk levels. And whilst obviously companies should be prepared to all types of potential future possible pathway scenarios, it is important to be prepared also to the worst case scenario, to a pessimistic scenario where water risks are expected to increase the most. And finally, last but not least, the results of the water risk filter can then help improve corporate disclosure as recommended by TCFD by providing reliable, consistent, and comparable information on current as well as future water risks and opportunities, which will help in turn then financial institutions be able to make better informed and strategic long-term investment decisions, which is the aim of TCFD. But also I just wanted to flag that there is the new water and value tool, WAVE tool, being developed, which will also very much help strengthen the process with regards to disclosure on financial exposure. And so just to give you a little bit of more background on the new WAVE tool, which is being in development and beta testing. And it's really the aim is to enable users to explore how water risk exposure may potentially affect financial value. This WAVE tool will be embedded in the water risk filter tool, but it will be available to download as an Excel, a user-guided Excel tool basically. And it aims to combine information from leveraging the water risk filter risk results, both base and operational, as well as probability data, along with some user-entered financial information within the offline Excel. The tool will then be able to use all these inputs and draw from corporate disclosure information to help link risk and financial impacts, be drawn from the CDP database, and with the objectives to then conduct a Monte Carlo simulation model, which runs repeatedly for a 10-year period duration in order to be able to stress test information and generate a discounted cash flow analysis. And if you want to learn more about it, please check out these reports that I'm flagging here on linking water risk and financial value, which explores a lot of the rationale and thinking behind this new WAVE tool. So in conclusion, the water risk filter scenarios are TCFD aligned in order to help financial institutions and companies turn risk into resilience. There are a lot of resources available on the Water Risk Filter homepage with tutorials and videos. And if you want to learn more about the water risk filter scenarios, do check out our brief with guidance on how to use the scenarios, as well as more background on them. And lastly, there is an excellent report just been out this month with regards to rising to resilience, how water stewardship can help business build climate resilience. So a lot of information to explore even further, but very happy to address all your questions in the next few minutes during the Q&A. Thank you very much.
Hi, Ariane.
Good day.
Thanks very much for that great presentation. I think that kind of built on, what Conor laid out in terms of the functionality of the water risk filter, and how that's emphasized to corporates, and then specifically linking it to the risks around climate change. I'm hoping that Becca will alert me if a question comes in while we're finishing off now. I don't see any specifically related to this presentation, but I think what's really standing out for me is, the whole move that you ended off with there about the shift from risk to resilience, and about evaluating opportunities to build resilience. And I think a lot of the people who've joined us today, working in catchment partnerships, see that as a key opportunity. So is there any specific guidance, or are there pointers, or maybe that's an opportunity for the kind of next version to think about, how can tools like this guide private sector participants towards finding their catchment partnerships that will help them to build that resilience?
Yes, thank you. No, excellent question indeed. So I guess first of all, the piece on the water risk filter scenarios that we've launched, we're very much, we listen to our users and what our users are needing, and also the movement of the space, and with the huge momentum around TCFD requiring more forward-looking scenarios to be able to plan better with regards to in the future, and thinking about how to integrate better in businesses strategies and strategic decision making on this topic, and how to prove that they are going to be resilient in the future. The challenge with the future is that we don't know what it's going to look like, and so scenario analysis is that powerful tool to be able to also it's a powerful tool to manage uncertainties and to start thinking about, as a company, is my strategy going to be resilient with regards to the potential future possibilities of how potential scenarios might look like. And so it's really helping to make that starting point of like thinking, understanding what could be the potential future water risks, and understanding whether your strategies and response plans currently in place are strong enough, or are going to be adequately resilient under different potential futures. So it's an exercise. It's a challenging exercise for sure. It's still very new for a lot of companies starting in this space. But yeah, we see a lot of momentum. We've just launched these scenarios. We've tested it out with a few partners, and we are, as you've heard, more and more thinking about how we can leverage our tool to help think about from risk to resilience. We have a section in the tool called the response section, which does provide some recommendations. It is currently built more on based on your exposure to current risk, what kind of actions you should be considering as a company. And we are looking at improving that section into building more on the resilience thinking and type of more longer term also actions, and incorporating, for example, like climate, water resilience, it cannot be fully achieved at a site scale. It requires a basin level efforts. And so how to, and also pushing on that message of a greater attention on nature-based solutions. You flagged the report from WWF that was just launched last month on rising to resilience. And so there is, we're going to be looking at how we can integrate more of that sort of longer term aspects and the focus on resilience and nature-based solutions as and guidance on those topics via our tool and other obviously resources and materials that we'll be putting out in the future. But yeah, we are evolving the tool still. So it's the new scenarios is the first step, and we'll be looking at how we can improve other aspects of the tool to help guide companies with regards to their understanding and thinking about resilience planning. Maybe the last thing I'll just say is that we're looking at how basically obviously the scenario analysis is an important step, but it's not the end. It's really the outputs should be helped to, as I said, evaluate that. Are your as a company, are your strategies, your response actions adequately resilient? And the scenario analysis is meant to be as a process to help in those discussions to incorporate, in a company's risk management and strategic planning. And we are exploring, how to even improve our tool to help with that, those discussions that they should be having.
And you showed us the many institutions that you've collaborated with, and the data sets and models that you've tapped into. So I mean, it really is an amazing resource that's freely available for everybody to dive into and have a detailed look. So even if you're not a corporate, if you're a catchment partner, you can go into your catchment, pretend to be either a manufacturer or a farmer or whatever it is, and have a look at what those companies would be, the kind of feedback that they'd be getting back from the tool. So I think it's a very exciting kind of next step development, now making it link directly to TCFD as well.
Absolutely. I think I would definitely encourage to have a look at the tool, because I do believe it can help with regards to hopefully with your corporate engagement plans, and how, if you're understanding the risks in the future and helping also with your discussions with corporates on the ground. It's a very powerful tool, and it's free to use. So, and there's some great resources in the tool, both in our reports section, and we're very transparent about our methodology, what data sets we use. So you can have access to all of that information.
Great.
Thank you.
Thanks, Ariane. Thanks so much for your presentation and
participation.
Becca.
We do just have one question that's come through on the Q&A function, so I can read that. So Robin says, thanks, Ariane. How would we use the water risk filter tool and the wave tool to map the water risk created by aquaculture? Robin says, this is a fast-growing industry, and already 75% of the world's fish consumption is grown from aquaculture. So how do we incorporate this in water risk?
Good question. I haven't actually thought exactly about that topic, aquaculture. So we do have, our tool is meant to be used by companies in any sectors. We do have basically some default weightings based on the sectors, what kind of risks are most critical for the sector. We do not have at the moment a specific aquaculture sector, but that is something we have been in discussion and will be exploring. As you said, it's an important sector that is growing. We're having some internal discussions here, and something we will be looking into. So I don't have a perfect answer for now, but the tool, as I said, it's you can still in any case have a look at there's a lot of visualizations with the maps, as I said, and to be able to sort of understand at least the water context in those areas that you are interested in focusing in.
Great.
Thanks.
Thank you.
We've had the questions, so we can wrap up slightly early for lunch, which is nice. Our next session starts at 1:45, and it's the corporate panel discussion, and we're conscious that that's probably going to be a really fruitful discussion and probably lots of questions from all of our attendees. So we are planning for a very prompt 1:45 start on that. So we will look forward to seeing you then, and have a lovely lunch.
Thank you.
Okay, welcome all. I hope you've all managed to have a nice lunch break. According to my clock, that's 1:45, so we're going to commence this afternoon's session, which is basically a sort of a business panel to try and get a business perspective around water stewardship. I'm very pleased to welcome, or to be able to welcome, Liz Lowe, Head of Sustainability at Coke, Christina Downsend, Responsible Sourcing Manager at Tesco's, Sarah Wakefield, Sustainable Sourcing and Fair Trade Manager at Co-op, and Scott Reed, the Environmental Sustainability Officer at Nestle Waters. There's Scott. Before we go into the questions, and I'm really keen that we make sure we can provide enough sort of time in today's session, which will run for about an hour, to take as many questions from the floor as possible. We're going to go straight into a couple of pre-recorded presentations, one by Christina at Tesco's and one by Matt at Nestle. On the back of that, we'll go straight into a couple of questions, and then we'll take questions from the panel. So please use the QA function, and as we go through these presentations, drop your questions in advance, so we've got, we can go straight into those sessions as and when. But without further ado, Rebecca, could you tee up the presentations for us?
Hello, my name is Christina Downend. I'm the Sustainable Agriculture Manager at Tesco. Thank you very much for inviting me here today to tell you why water stewardship is important to Tesco. So at Tesco, we have what we call a Little Helps plan, which is our corporate social responsibility plan. This is a publicly available plan that we've published for the last few years. And within it, we cover off areas like people, so the things like human rights in our supply chain, what we're doing about that, the health and safety and well-being of our supply chain and our colleagues, and diversity and inclusion. And then also we have an area that covers product, and that really looks into food waste and packaging and the health and diets for our customers, and as well as animal welfare. And we also have a pillar on places, which is all about kind of the support that we're providing to local communities, either in where our stores are or within our supply base as well. But the bit that I'm going to talk to you today about is the planet bit, because within the planet bit we have, as well as marine and forests, we also have climate change and agriculture in there, and that's where water stewardship sits. So within the particular planet pillar of our Little Helps plan, we have an overall ambition to cover off these different aspects. And that's because we recognise that our success depends on the health and stability of the natural environment. And so we're committed to leading the industry in addressing sustainability challenges within the key supply chains, and advocate for sustainable agriculture practices that protect important ecosystems, soil health and biodiversity, and of course water stewardship is one of those. Within our sustainable agriculture agenda, we cover four main areas. We cover soil health, biodiversity on farm, climate and climate change, so that looks at carbon emissions coming from farms, as well as water, and that's to do with water quality as well as water scarcity. And as you'll all be aware, all of these cross over and they're all interlinked. our overall ambitions, we have a couple, or have quite a lot actually, but the relevant ones are within our Little Helps plan, we want to sustainably source all of our agricultural products. And then within our WWF Tesco partnership, which some of you may be aware of, our aim is to halve the environmental impact of the average UK shopping basket, which is a really big aim. And within that partnership, we actually have a basket metric. So we call it the basket metric. It's a way to measure, we're hoping to measure the success of the partnership and towards our aim as well. And within that basket metric, we have one of our key KPIs is to increase the percentage of fresh food from regions within sustainable water management. And of course, we recognise that the most effective way to understand whether water resources are being managed sustainably is to assess their use at landscape and regional level, not just on individual farms or sites. Hence why water stewardship's really important. And the target for that is to actually increase that to 50% by 2030. Specifically within our own sustainable agriculture strategy on water, we tend to focus on 3 key areas of improve, transform and advocate, recognising that these don't come sequentially but often run in parallel. So the improve things are the things that we know that are relatively easy wins, and that there's ways of solving them and ways of progressing them quite easily. So improve, we look at kind of scaling up water monitoring within the supply chain as well as on-farm water management, so encouraging our suppliers to think about on-farm water management. And then for transforming this area, we look at embedding water risk and governance into our sourcing decisions. So there's a lot of work going on at the moment to try and embed that within our sourcing decisions. And then also support catchment level projects, which is obviously a lot of what we're doing already, but in specific catchments. And then advocating wise, that's really about trying to scale up the water stewardship catchment level projects to ensure that every stakeholder in that catchment is involved and a steward of that catchment. We have quite a few different levers we can pull to try and achieve these things, and we have those listed at the bottom there. That includes things like our sustainable farming groups, and we specifically have within those groups benchmarking, so that we're able to benchmark our farmers between each other. And then also we would like to work with our sustainable farming groups to trial innovations as well. So whenever there's a new innovation that comes along that we could do with some more insights into if it's actually feasible or not, we work with our farming groups to do that. We also have internal mechanisms. So within our internal procurement teams, for example, we have category plans. So within those plans, we have water management plans as part of their KPIs, so ensuring that their suppliers have water management plans, for example. And then also we look to improve standards, so not only our own buying standards and the purchasing standards, but also third-party standards. So we like to engage and advocate for third-party standards improvements as well. And then I've already mentioned the WWF partnership, but of course we're working with the Rivers Trust and as part of the Courtauld 2025 working group as well. And as of course we work with other industry forums as well, to all part of the advocacy work. And if we're able to achieve all of that, then we hope that we will be able to ensure that we have a resilient environment, and that environment that we rely on for our food. And so we hope that ensures that our farm businesses are resilient as well. And then if our farm businesses are resilient, then obviously the sourcing for Tesco is resilient, and we have security of supply going forward, and we haven't got a very large impact on the environment. And so we hope to go around in this virtuous circle where we have a resilient environment that's fit for the future. So that's it from me. Thank you very much, and I look forward to your questions at the end.
Hi, my name is Matthew Ryan. I'm the Water Resource Manager at Nestle Waters UK. I'm going to give you a very quick overview of water stewardship at Nestle Waters, using some examples from case studies in our European operations. As a business, our purpose is to bring waters directly from nature to our customers to support healthier drinking habits and the sustained health of our planet. However, with this comes a responsibility to be good custodians of the natural resources and landscapes in our care. Our waters are completely natural and are a true reflection of the environment that we source them from. Aside from filtration, absolutely no treatment for spring or natural mineral water is permitted. So from this standpoint, you can see just how important the protection of our sources is to the sustainability of our business. And this is why from 2019, we committed to certifying all of our sites to the Alliance for Water Stewardship standard. We're currently tracking quite well towards this target at the moment, with 28 of our 82 global factories currently accredited. Wherever we operate, we aim to promote good water stewardship principles and practices where possible, act as a catalyst for collective action. It's really important that this approach is relevant to the local context, particularly as no two catchments are ever the same, and the challenges affecting the water environment can be dependent on many different factors. A key outcome of water stewardship that's embedded within the AWS standard is to ensure water resources are managed in a way that's socially, environmentally, and economically beneficial. At Nestle, we visualize this through our water stewardship ladder, which you can see here on the right of this slide. Improving management of our water resources through community relations programs, building internal expertise, and leveraging new technologies like our water management dashboards developed by our partner Aquasay is really a focus of all of our factories now, and this provides us with opportunities for further water use efficiency and driving down our environmental footprint even further. In many locations, we're working with others through collective actions and initiatives beyond the gates of the factory to ensure long-term sustainability of our shared resources, and what we strive to be a net contributor to the environment by improving biodiversity and building nature-based solutions to address shared water challenges where they exist. To demonstrate this, I'll now share with you some case studies from mature initiatives that have been operational for a number of years in our French and Swiss markets. Around our site in Vittel, which is in the east of France, the AgriVert program was developed with researchers from the Natural Agricultural Research Institute and local stakeholders around 30 years ago. Vittel is a well-known brand of natural mineral water in Europe. You may have seen it on the Tour de France or in the French Open tennis. It takes its name from the spa town from which the water is drawn. It's a major employer in the town and the region, and as a result, any risk to the water quality of the source is an existential threat to not only our brand and business, but also to the town and the employment around the area. Intensification of agriculture and the transition from hay to corn-based fodder in the 1980s resulted in a significant increase in nitrate concentrations in the soil and shallow groundwater, which are starting to pose a major threat to the high quality water resources which are at greater depth. The response of the business was to develop AgriVert, which is set up as a Nestle managed agricultural subsidiary, which is tasked with developing and overseeing a radical change in the region's agricultural model, and that's been in place since 1992. The focus of this was on achieving zero pesticide use and significantly reduced nitrate levels within the catchments. Also securing the presence of meadows, hedges and grassy strips in the heart of agricultural plots, and implementing an alfalfa-based crop rotation. In doing so, the AgriVert team has worked with 11 separate municipalities with 12,000 local inhabitants and 37 partner farms to protect and preserve over 10,000 hectares of local farmland and the mineral waters sourced from beneath these lands. This has not been easy, and it's not been cheap, as anyone involved in the program will attest, but the results now, almost 3 decades on, really do speak for themselves. Long-term commitment to a sustainable farming model has delivered substantial benefits in terms of water quality, not only for us, but for other water users in the catchment. Improvements to soil health and significant improvements to biodiversity, as you can see here. This initiative is really well documented through case studies that are widely available on the internet. If you are interested in reading more about this, which I'd encourage you to, I suggest that you seek out the case study done by the FAO, which provides a much more detailed breakdown of the benefits, but also the mechanisms through which this scheme operates.
The second project I'd like to discuss with you is located in the area around our Henier factory, which is in the southwest of Switzerland. The initiative is called EcoBra, and it's created a partnership of around 70 local farmers to preserve and protect the shared water resources of the catchment and local area. Similarly, with a focus on reduction of fertilizer application and the use of pesticides, particularly within sensitive areas of the catchment. This is a spring catchment, so there are certain areas that are more vulnerable, I guess, than others. There are three key projects at the heart of this initiative, the first of which was the creation of an ecological network of around 1,500 hectares of farmland to enable wildlife to use them as corridors between farmland and their natural habitat. Second was the development of in-stream filtration to remove undesirable elements such as pesticides from the surface water before they're able to infiltrate further into the aquifer. And the third, and probably the most ambitious and exciting, was the construction and operation of a biogas plant to transform organic waste from the regional agricultural and industrial activity into a clean, renewable energy source, and also with the byproduct being a high-quality organic fertilizer. The result of this is effectively a circular exchange of waste products from agriculture and industry into energy and nutrients. The biogas facility turns around 30,000 tonnes of manure and industrial waste into high-quality organic fertilizer, particularly for subscribers to the initiative. And this also produces around 7 gigawatt hours of electricity for the local area and households, and around 8 gigawatt hours of heat for industrial processes at the factory as well, which would have been sourced through non-renewable means. Again, there are a number of excellent resources online should you wish to learn a little bit more about this project. These are just two examples of initiatives that are currently operational within the business that continue to inspire the rest of us and the rest of the industry, I think, to seek out solutions to some shared challenges that we all have. Similar to Vittel and Henier, Buxton is a brand that's intrinsically linked to the town from which the water is sourced. While the context of the water sources are very different, the importance of the brand being synonymous with the town and everything that goes with it really emphasises the need for us, Nestle Waters, to be seen as a catalyst for positive change, particularly concerning environmental issues. In Buxton, our community relations program has been in place for over 4 years now and has demonstrated annual improvements in our local engagement activities and acceptability index, and has proven to build some really strong relationships with local stakeholders. We have internal resources dedicated to community and sustainability matters at our factories, and these work really closely with our water resources teams at the factories as well to quickly identify potential opportunities for collaboration, but also to identify potential risks to the shared water resources of the area on the basis of discussions that have been held or initiatives or programs that are being proposed for the area, particularly planning applications and these sorts of things. This active participation in the community has allowed the site to build relationships within our catchment, understand the needs of the community, and create greater transparency about our operation and how we do business. I think, which in the early days of this process was a key concern, was that the business was not transparent enough with how it operates. This in turn has provided us with a great foundation for engaging with the community on a deeper level on topics related to water and biodiversity, both of which are key priorities in Buxton and areas where we're continually looking for additional opportunities for collective actions with other stakeholders in the catchment. We also now have a second facility in Princes Gate Water, which is in southwest Wales, Pembrokeshire, which was acquired in 2018. And we're really on the start of the same journey down there in terms of community relations and understanding the shared water challenges and opportunities that exist within that catchment. So early days down there, but watch this space. In Buxton, we've built a solid foundation of trust through this community relations process that I speak of. We've regularly hosted educational events with local schools and interest groups, and when possible, opened the facility up to a wide range of like-minded stakeholders and community groups, associations, and so on for hosting meetings, and just to give them a bit of a feel for what we do and what interests we have that are shared, I suppose. We're now also focusing on addressing shared water challenges within the local catchment together with a diverse range of stakeholders, including regulators, members of the academic community, NGOs and other private companies. Of particular note at the moment is a collaborative effort with the Environment Agency to address an ongoing flood risk issue in the Buxton area. So we're looking at opportunities to host an NFM scheme in our catchment area, and we're also looking at how we can take a greater role in efforts to improve the condition of the River Wye, which flows through the centre of Buxton. There's a special area of conservation downstream of Buxton, which is continuously shown to be at risk of elevated phosphate, which is known to be from point sources and diffuse pollution in the headlands of the catchment. So we're now working to link up a number of separate initiatives within the catchment to ensure the common benefits to the environment are realised. So there's a lot of different and separate projects that are underway in Buxton, which is a very active area in terms of environmental studies. So we've recently held a Shared Water Challenges Forum, which is really aiming to bring everyone together and seek alignment across all parties working in the catchment to identify potential opportunities for collaboration and sharing more information to get the best possible outcomes for not only the river but the wider catchment. You can see from the examples from Vittel and Henio that we're not just in this for the accreditation or external recognition. The reality is that water stewardship must continue to be at the heart of our business and how we operate in order for our business to be sustainable. Using the examples from these flagship projects that are presented to you today, many markets, including the UK, are actively looking for ways to take big steps towards collective actions that not only address the issues directly concerning our business, but also those affecting the wider water environment in areas that we operate. New plans are being drawn up at the moment at a corporate level to ensure that all of our sites become net contributors to their catchments operating areas by 2025, with the key focus being on addressing existing water challenges that we've identified through the AWS process, but also improving the overall ecological health of our catchment areas. So I look forward to providing you with more of an update on this in due course. Thank you very much for your time today.
Brilliant. Well, I hope you found those presentations both inspiring and thought-provoking in equal measure. I'm hoping that we can get all our panelists joining us. Hello, Christina.
Hiya.
Hiya. And there we have Scott. Sarah, hello, Sarah, and hello, Liz. Brilliant. Thank you again for joining us and spending some time out of your very busy diaries just to share your reflections and thoughts on water stewardship. Before we go to the questions, can I just ask you all just to give a very quick sort of introduction to who you are and what your experience and role is in terms of water stewardship within your organisations. So let's start with you, Liz, if that's okay.
Yeah, sure. Hi, everyone. I'm Liz Lowe. I lead on sustainability within Coca-Cola Great Britain. I've been working on water stewardship for at least 9 years now, in partnership with not only the Rivers Trust, but WWF, and working very closely with our local bottling partner, Coca-Cola European Partners.
Fantastic. Thanks, Liz. Let's go to you next, Sarah, because you're the next one I can see on my screen.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Sarah Wakefield. I work for the Co-op and I cover sustainable sourcing and fair trade. And so water comes in as part of that as one of the key themes around sustainable sourcing. So it's one of many projects and areas I'm happy to work on. And I should say I co-chair the RAP Water Steering Group as part of the Courtauld Commitment, which I'm sure we'll come on to.
Yeah, and you do a very good job of it too. So thank you. Christina, and then we'll go to Scott.
Hiya, I'm Christina Downend. I'm the Sustainable Agriculture Manager, so lead the Sustainable Agriculture work at Tesco. Within the Sustainable Agriculture area, as you saw from the presentation, obviously water is a key aspect of that. And so far, we've been mainly involved in kind of via the Courtauld Commitment, which we'll go into, I'm sure, as well as other kind of projects with WWF as part of our partnership.
Thank you. And Scott, which I'm sure you're out there somewhere.
Yes, thanks, Alex. My name's Scott Reed. I'm the Environment and Sustainability Officer for Nestle Waters in the UK, based at our Buxton site, so in the Peak District. In terms of my experience with water stewardship, currently working on the site certification to the Alliance for Water Stewardship standard, and also work on external community and stakeholder relations within our local catchment.
Brilliant, great. So just for everyone else's benefit, we've got a couple of questions I want to run through, but if you've got questions coming from the panel, we'll deal with these ones and then we'll go to panel-wide questions. And I know we've had one or two that come in already. So I think a question specifically for Liz and Sarah, if I may, because you haven't had the opportunity to do the presentations. I'm keen to understand why water stewardship is important to your business and how it aligns to your wider sustainability agenda, if at all. So I'll go with you, Sarah, first, if that's okay.
Yeah, thanks, Alex. And I mean, I think everyone is on the call today because they recognise that water is important to all businesses and all organisations. I think what's really challenging for retailers is getting that water message into our wider work. So obviously we have our broader sustainability agenda, and kind of akin to Tesco, we all have our own plans. And water is a core part of that. But I think what's really interesting for businesses for a long time, it was very much seen as managing the water impact of your own operations, which obviously for a retailer is relatively limited. So I think over the last few years, there's been a real expansion of retailers' eyes into the world of stewardship and supply chains. And I think things like the WWF water risk filter have been really, really helpful in bringing to life the importance of water stewardship and resilience. And the way most of my colleagues will experience the challenges of water to us as an organisation is when we end up with interruptions to supply. So when things are no longer on our shelves, or we have quality issues associated with produce, and that really brings to life the importance of good water management, good water stewardship and resilience to climate-based weather events. And the way we embed it in our work is very much through this collaborative approach, which I know we will go into. But the reason for that is, although the Co-op looks like a really big brand, we source thousands of products from every part of the world using tens of thousands of ingredients. And so being able to understand the water impact of all those little bits can be very hard. And that's why the approach we are now taking through Courtauld of looking at stewardship of whole areas is incredibly helpful, and really plug this into our grower and protein livestock base as well, to help them have impact. I'll pause there because I want Liz to have a chance as well.
Brilliant, thanks, Sarah. Liz?
Yeah, I mean, so many of the key themes and topics have been touched on by, loads of the content we've heard today about why water is so important to businesses. I mean, obviously, why water is so important to the Coca-Cola business is it's the absolute heart of our business. If we didn't have water, we wouldn't have a business. I mean, it's just as simple as that. And if we want to carry on having a business, we need to look after the water that we use. And again, lots of the themes that have come out today, water is a shared resource. It's not a right that we absolutely have to take that water. We have to have the license to use that water and the social license as well. And water, not only is about our operations and what we actually put in our bottles and cans, but again, as everyone has touched on, it's about our supply chains. It's about the agricultural ingredients that grow, that we use in our drinks. So water absolutely underpins the business, and we've been, on a journey of water stewardship, because I think, it's never perfect. There's always a lot more to do. And we've been evolving our water strategy and very much linking it to our sustainable sourcing strategy as time goes on and as the years have gone by. We've been learning lessons everywhere we operate. And I think that's one of the sort of quite interesting and useful things. I mean, it's not, again, about being a multinational, is that you've got a lot of examples from other markets where they have maybe similar issues with water and climate. And again, that link to climate is, I think, now one of the most pressing sort of areas, and actually one of the most salient areas for corporates, where water and the effects on water are really as a result of, we're seeing that now as a result of the changing climate and the unpredictability of the climate. So I think that link to climate is a huge one for our sustainability strategy. And how it links into sourcing. And again, the work we've done on nature-based solutions to water challenges, again, really shows the benefits of those to address, only in a small scale at the moment, to address climate, so through the sort of carbon sequestration, also to address, biodiversity and nature loss, which again, every business will, and every part of society will suffer from if we don't do something at scale to address that. So the interconnectedness of everything, I think, is the theme for us.
Very pleased to hear it. Yes, because it's all part and parcel of the same mix, isn't it? Right, thank you for that. I'm going to go to, we've got some questions rolling in, some of which I suspect are going to be rather challenging, but we will go try and tackle those. The first one that's come in is from Sam. Hello, Sam. And I think this one's for Christina, really. So how can you give some ideas of the metrics used by Tesco's to measure resilience?
It is quite a challenging question. I think if we all had the answer to that, then we'd be happy. There are obviously lots of potential metrics that could be used. For resilience in particular, I suppose we would say if if the source is sustainable, so for the future, and then it's kind of a case of how do you define what's sustainable. So we try to define it through our sustainable agriculture agenda, and as we saw, the 4 kind of key areas that we look at. And then within that, we try to develop and support kind of metrics. So some of them are more advanced than others. So obviously carbon can be measured at the moment, or well, can be measured better than soil health, for example, or more it's more common to measure carbon than it is soil health. But for water, it would be things like, do you have a water management plan on farm? And are you part of a landscape level project where available? So those kind of things are the way that we currently measure it, but it's an ongoing area that we look to develop further, and especially in collaboration, because obviously we want to try to reduce the burden on farmers. So if we just ask them a few questions that covers off everyone's kind of requests, then that would help.
Yeah, and I suppose a follow-up question to that, this sort of to everybody, and I appreciate this is a massive question, so it's difficult to answer, but what's your sense from a kind of corporate perspective in terms of this opportunities to align various metrics? Because we know ultimately, if you want to measure something, if you want to get it done, it needs to be measured, and there's nothing worse than having lots of different measures that, particularly from a farmer perspective, they're having to deal with 4, 5, 6 different type of metrics. So kind of question for all of you really, in terms of, it might sound like a leading question, do you think the industry is moving towards more consistency with the metrics and sharing metrics across the piece? Sarah, I'm going to pick on you to start off with. I
think from a retailer perspective, from what I see, I appreciate Christina's view on this. I'm all for unification of metrics, because like you allude to, Alex, the biggest feedback we get from suppliers and farmers is you all make us fill in loads and loads of questionnaires and they don't actually change anything, but we're all reporting to you in slightly different ways. And I think there are learnings to be taken from the climate agenda and carbon, as Christina again has alluded to, where there is that convergence around certain metrics. So I think the openness is there. I know the Rivers Trust are doing some work on this at the moment, as Alex, and I think that is warmly received. And I think without that consolidation and agreement about what measures should be, you will end up finding businesses making stuff up because we feel the need to report and understand. But I think it's about the whole of the value chain and all of the water stakeholders taking responsibility for it. I often say I am not an expert on water, and so I really warmly welcome the experts in helping guide how we measure and monitor and actually, importantly, drive change, because that is what we all want to see. Yeah, don't wait for the retailers, I always say.
Yeah, fair enough. Are there any others got reflections on that, Christina, Scott, or Liz?
So I was just going to jump in and say, it is a really hard one. I think, Sarah's absolutely right. Corporates want to be able to measure, to report back, because they need to see, they need to evidence a business case for investment a lot of the time. And I think, the other thing that's, we've been using a replenish methodology, which was developed for us globally by Limnatech in the US. That's what we have traditionally used to measure water quantity impacts. And so the projects and the programs which we've invested in with partnerships locally, we measure for this replenish commitment we have globally to find the volumetrics of equivalent of water that we're putting back into communities and nature. It's also can be used for quality issues as well. So we're looking at solutions where we can measure water quality impacts before and after an intervention or a program of interventions. And I think the other thing that's really exciting and interesting, and the thing that I think everyone wants to try and find the holy grail for, is how you undertake a sort of natural capital approach and understand all the co-benefits that you can get from nature-based solutions, from all of the great stuff that we've been talking about. Some of those Nestle examples have been amazing on biodiversity, on community amenity, carbon sequestration, and so on. So I think the more that we can kind of strive towards some sort of cohesion around one set or several smaller set of kind of measurements, that would be fantastic, I think, for everybody.
Brilliant. Scott, have you got anything to add to this before we move on to some other questions?
Nothing specifically to add, but I think just referring back to the slide that my colleague Matt presented on the water stewardship ladder, and the start of that is transparency. So in terms of water stewardship commitments, it's about transparency.
Good point. We'll stick with you, Scott, for the moment, because there's a couple of questions that have come in. One of which is probably more straightforward. One I suspect might be a bit technical and Swiss specific, but a question from Arlene. Hello, Arlene, about the example in Switzerland and the AD plant, which at a kind of cyclic closed systems model is great, but particularly in the UK, we've had some quite major issues, or are having some major issues with maize growing and being perhaps kind of damage to soil and what have you. I suppose it's a specific question about, are you feeding maize into your AD digester, or is it actually just products from the plant and elsewhere, rather than growing sort of specific green crops to feed it?
Thanks, Alex. Yeah, I'm as you noted there, it's a very Swiss specific question with myself being based in Buxton, and it's if I'm honest, it's not one I immediately would have the answer to, so I wouldn't like to provide the answer on that here, but it's something I can speak to colleagues about, and obviously in beyond what Matt presented on his slide there regarding the local coffee factories and plants that feed into that.
Okay, well, just sticking with you then, Scott, and just a note, email coming in from Steve. Scott, as part of your AWS work and stakeholder engagement, what have your main lessons learnt been in the stakeholder engagement process?
Yeah, so it's a really good question. I think the Alliance for Water Stewardship framework has been, and going through that process has been transformative in our thinking and our approach. And I think the idea of shared water challenges is key to that. and in terms of understanding the local context and understanding even the local catchment opportunities there are, so the catchment networks, for example, and what the input opportunities are there.
Brilliant. Well, I think that might be a theme we come back to. I'll just trying to scroll through all this. I think we'll come back to that theme about stakeholder engagement and communities, and particularly the links back to CaBA, because in my simplistic view of the world, you start to think about water stewardship, you look at catchment partnerships, there's natural synergies there. But quick question for Christina coming in from Poland is it possible to find out which Tesco sustainable farmer groups are active?
At the moment, I think we have a list on our website, but they're actually going through a bit of a change or a revamp at the moment. So we're hoping that next year we'll be able to relaunch some of them and provide more details. At the moment, they're kind of sector specific, so rather than local area specific, but there's a move to look to see if we can actually develop any new ones that are location based potentially and have a mix of sectors, for this exact reason that we're interested in landscape level projects and work.
That personally sounds like a fantastic development. Right, so keep on your questions coming in if you would. I've got a couple of questions here that I'm quite too keen to explore. And this question for all of you, which we'll take in turn, is what is the biggest challenge with implementing water stewardship objectives in the UK thus far? Big question, I know, sorry. And I suppose in answering that, it's this point around collaboration, collective action. So, again, your experiences on how to implement this on the ground would be really useful. So let's start with you, Christina, if you may.
Okay, so biggest challenges. I mean, I'm sure we're all aware there are quite a few, but I suppose some, especially for retailers, as Sarah's already mentioned, we are often a kind of a level or two away from the grower and farm base, which with every additional level makes it, or layer, kind of makes it a little bit harder to engage. So that's hence why we have started and going to revamp our sustainable farming groups. To try and get a better connection and engagement directly with our farming group and farming areas. So that has been a challenge in kind of to begin with. And I suppose, as I think Liz mentioned as well, it has been, or historically, it's been difficult to make the business case when you don't necessarily have metrics or measures to be able to take back to the business. So that has been a bit of an issue, but thankfully, obviously, the business recognises the importance of it, but still would like to monitor and measure. So, yeah, and then also just another one, difficult, I suppose, I've mentioned this, to put a value on it as well. So this is why, again, as Liz mentioned, having a natural capital accounting kind of methodology would be really useful, because then we could really put kind of value on it. And I suppose the other big thing is kind of, these are all, there are many kind of catchments, lots of different projects going on, and having an understanding of what's going on where has been quite difficult to navigate as well. So that's why kind of collaboration and these kind of groups are really important, to try and get us all together to understand what's going on. What was the other question? Sorry, Alex.
It was around the collaboration. I guess, and you've already sort of touched on collaboration. It was kind of collaboration between and amongst businesses, because ultimately, your business is one part of this wider picture. We've all agreed that standard metrics and approaches will help accelerate the change of the business case. Any specific, at the end of the day, your Tesco's, you're about as big as you get out there. Has that been, or are you finding it a challenge for collaboration with other retailers and other businesses?
I suppose it depends. I think at the beginning it was a bit difficult, because quite often we're almost on a voyage of discovery, each one of us, to determine kind of what are our kind of priority areas that we want to focus on. And if those priorities didn't align, then it meant that it was quite difficult to actually progress things collaboratively. And then, so that has been a bit difficult. But I think, as Liz and Sarah have mentioned about the climate change issues and the fact that we are seeing impacts on our quality potentially of our fruit and veg and things like that. We know that it's really important, and I think everyone's now realizing that, hence why you've got all of us here on the call today. And so we know that it does make it easier if we work collaboratively, so we're willing to kind of put that effort in now at the start to kind of work collaboratively in these Courtauld groups and other projects.
Brilliant, thanks. Sarah, then Liz.
Yeah, so on the challenge front, I would say one of the most interesting reflections I have looking back at the kind of 4 or 5 years I've been engaging on water, is that I feel there is a huge amount of, I'm trying to phrase this diplomatically and I'm struggling, but I think there is a huge amount of frustration about lack of action. And I think that can sometimes create challenges in communication around who does what. And I'm sure I'm going to get a wry smile out of Alex, because the amount of times he has heard me talk about what do you actually want, in my case, a retailer to do, and what levers do realistically I, as a retail organisation, have to pull, and what levers do others have to pull in the supply chain and across the water world. And I think we are still challenged somewhat in being able to understand, as people that are all really passionate at trying to do the right thing on water, what role each organisation is actually trying to play. And the reason I mention frustration is because I think sometimes when we are frustrated about lack of progress, it can then come out as, well, we haven't made any progress because the retailers just won't get behind a project, or they won't tell us this, or there's not transparency there, or there's not money here. And I think the reason we keep talking about Courtauld is because that steering group brings together all those actors and is trying really hard to focus energy on things that we can all do. But I think learning how to talk to each other has actually been really difficult in some ways. We are getting there, but it remains a challenge. And I think expectation setting is super important. And I know you touched on that, Alex, in your presentation this morning. So thank you.
Yeah, no, I think it's very good points well made, and I think there's that thing about that, almost this kind of common language almost around water stewardship, and what that means is, to my mind, we've made a massive amount of progress, but there's still a lot more to do, not just amongst the Courtauld partners and those who are kind of into water, but actually amongst the wider kind of conservation movement, regulatory movement, etc. Because if we're all speaking with a common language, it's much easier to get those common goals pinned down. So Liz, and then I'm going to to you, Scott, particularly around some experiences in Buxton. So Liz, please.
Yeah, sure. I mean, my mind's racing as I'm hearing everything, and there's a couple of things that, just to chuck into the discussion, which I think are really important things for people to think about in terms of, the challenges for sort of almost, really getting this urgency of action that we all want to see from businesses who we all know are absolutely reliant on water, and who may all source from a particular catchment. There's two sort of big levers. One is consumer demand, because ultimately, consumers are more and more voting with their pounds and pennies in terms of the kinds of goods and services they want to buy from the kinds of retailers that they believe are doing the right thing, and the kind of brands they believe are doing the right thing. So I think that's a huge factor that is growing and will grow, and I think will really, prompt more brands and businesses to take action, because they can't afford not to in that sense. They will not be bought anymore. And I think the other thing is obviously the regulatory landscape, which you just mentioned there. So we've got some policies, coming through, the agriculture bill, the environment bill, which are going to be really directly, massively changing the way things are done in the world of farming. Brexit, there's just so much that is coming down the line in terms of policy that will, again, have huge impacts on our supply chains and on the way our farmers are incentivized to produce and to farm, hopefully to actually do the right thing by the environment that we all want to see. And so I think, as our for example, us as our big suppliers, the British Sugars of this world are sort of, really working to kind of galvanise their farmers and start to kind of really wade in and be very, very active. We're also then in the middle of the chain to our customers, who are the likes of, Sarah and Christina. So, they're demanding from us that we also do the right thing. So I think there's, again, this theme of, we are all interconnected and we all are trying to drive in the same direction. But I do think there's a momentum coming now with these levers of policy and consumer demand that we haven't had so sort of, acutely, which will really force and hopefully prompt more of this engagement, more of this urgency of collaboration we all want to see.
Brilliant, thanks, Liz. And Scott, and particularly, I know you've been deeply embroiled in the Buxton site and going through AWS accreditation, etc. And you've been on this journey kind of, in quite the level of detail for the last few years. So just in terms of what's been your sort of immediate or kind of challenges around trying to implement your water stewardship ambitions locally?
Yeah, I think it's almost I've come on to turning that challenge into an opportunity, I think. But I think the immediate challenge we're facing, as you say, Alex, the water stewardship journey in Buxton has been a few years in the making. So we're really still at the start of that journey as we reach out for an Alliance for Water Stewardship certification. But I think an initial challenge is understanding what local catchment networks exist and the visibility of them and our input opportunities. And I think through local dialogue and conversations with local stakeholders, it became apparent to us, I think, in the immediate vicinity, in our immediate local catchment, that network maybe wasn't that visible and wasn't that easy to engage with in terms of the visibility of it and awareness of it. So I think as I mentioned before in the response around the Alliance for Water Stewardship and the transformative approach of looking at shared water challenges provides those collaborative opportunities almost to act as a catalyst. For example, we recently hosted a virtual forum on shared water challenges in the Buxton catchment and brought together some key stakeholders, local agencies, local authorities to discuss what those shared water challenges are and the opportunities to address. So I think identifying shared water challenges can inspire collective dialogue. So it kind of goes from challenge to opportunity.
So there's something, and just to paraphrase slightly, maybe provocatively, there's something about, the networks are out there, but they're perhaps not as visible or as accessible as, from a business perspective, you'd like them to be.
I think sorry, go on, Alex.
Yeah, but equally the value of creating, and it's brilliant that, Nestle's convened this, but creating kind of, should we say, appropriate fora for businesses to convene, both, I guess, businesses within that area, but and other key stakeholders to start to take people on that journey of what both the issues and opportunities might be.
Yeah, and I think the key aspect is the collective action and the collaborative action. So moving on from shared water challenges, identifying them, and then that inspires collective action and collaborative discussions. But it's as you say, it's understanding the local context, and there's obviously lots of stakeholders, lots of individuals, all working on their own priorities, and collective actions is the way of bringing that together, and everyone's working for the best interests as well.
Helpful, very helpful. I'm just going to pick up a couple of questions that have come into the panel. One from Rory. Has anyone worked on the panel worked with farm cluster groups to deliver landscape environmental outputs?
I mean, does that count the work we're doing with a lot of farmer groups, a lot of farmers in East Anglia, and they're delivering absolutely sort of landscape outputs on their land through a programme of interventions from farm advisors on the ground who are doing, all kinds of specifically tailored interventions on their land, whether that's silt traps, buffer strips, cover crops, moving farm gates to address, soil runoff, to address obviously water quality in nearby rivers. Is that an answer to the question?
It's definitely an answer to the question. It's a very good answer. shall I interject just slightly here in terms of the Courtauld work, Rory, and then maybe Christina and Sarah can add a little bit more colour if they're doing other parallel work. But a lot of the Courtauld projects, as you would have hopefully seen on the map earlier, that's at a catchment scale. Within that, there are various different farmer clusters, be it formal cluster groups or informal cluster groups or sector groups, etc. And a lot of the work that we're doing through the projects is working through those groups effectively, well, hopefully trying to join up as many of these dots as possible, because it's about bringing together those mutual interests from different ends of the kind of supply chain, I suppose. But Sarah, have you got anything specific?
Yeah, I think just to build on that, to really bring it to life, the idea, because we all have multiple farmers, but retailers very often will share suppliers as well, which I know, Alex, you did mention earlier also. And so that's one of the reasons we have come together in this commitment, recognising that even if on that map that Alex showed you only see a couple of logos, actually all the Courtauld signatories are committed to working on that particular project in that catchment. And that's really significant, because it means that we as Co-op are not setting up a bit of work in this bit of the Y, and M&S are doing something over here and Tesco are doing something down here. It means we're all joining up in one piece of work. And that was the whole principle behind setting this up, because we were seeing a splintering of activity, which wasn't helping anyone deliver the landscape level change. So the whole principle of those projects is based around that collaboration of basically every major retailer in the UK and a significant chunk of our supply base as well.
I'm very conscious of time, and in fact I've basically not got halfway through some of these questions, but Christina, have you got anything to add specifically on that point before I go on to one more question?
Go ahead.
Good, excellent, thank you very much. Again, a question for all the panelists, and I'm recognising we do have a diverse audience with us today, but a lot of catchment partnerships and people involved in catchment work. Do you have a key bit of advice or top tip for catchment partnerships, NGOs who want to support businesses such as yours on their water stewardship journey? I'm going to start with you, Scott, and then I'm going to go around the houses, if that's okay.
Yeah, I think it links back to what I've previously said and other panelists have said around the collaboration aspects, finding common goals, and recognizing as well that businesses can be a catalyst for collective action, and importantly, I think can provide time and resource and expertise in addressing shared challenges. So, for example, from our own business, we have water sources, so we've got lots of knowledge and expertise and data that in terms of sharing that knowledge, and it can be useful. And I think it's important for stakeholders not to draw their own and jump to their own conclusions about business priorities and goals, and don't let that be a barrier to dialogue with business and to reach out. I know personally, I love it when locally, I love it when an email comes in from a local stakeholder and there's an idea there, or there's an idea for collaboration. It's something that can always be discussed, especially if it's addressing shared water challenges in line with water stewardship commitments. And I think jumping back to the Alliance for Water Stewardship standard, I think that's a great mechanism for inspiring that collaboration and that collaborative work and thinking.
Brilliant, thanks, Scott. Christina, top tips.
Top tips, okay. I suppose a bit different, I think, to Scott. We don't necessarily have the expertise in Tesco to know everything about what's going on with the water. So definitely, I would say for collaboration purposes and engaging, be very clear about almost the business case of why Tesco would want to engage in this. I mean, we kind of have a good idea ourselves, obviously, but we kind of really need things spelled out to us, to be honest. So having being clear about kind of the objectives, how it works, kind of, and don't be shy to ask kind of what you think Tesco could provide as well, because, you know, as I say, sometimes we do really need it spelling out to us. And then, yeah, and also be clear about kind of that you've done your homework in a way. So what are the other collaborations going on, so that we are all not trying to reinvent the wheel here. So if there are other stakeholders in that area, we want to know about who's willing to engage as well, because that's obviously we're going to be more likely to engage on that as well. And also kind of, I suppose, if, long-term ambition wise, what's the potential scale up, or what's the long-term ambition of it as well, potential of those kind of bits of work. Yeah, so I think those are probably top tips from me.
Brilliant. Let's go to you, Liz, then Sarah.
I had written exactly the same thing down as Christina. I've got one more though. I think, one, be clear about the existing work and collaboration that's happening, that we may already be involved with, and maybe try and get involved there. Two, I just want to reiterate this point on clear asks. Like, whenever we interface into our business, the question we get asked is, but what do you want me to do? So the more you can help, the interfaces like me and Christina and Liz understand what you want us to do, the better. And I've forgotten the third one, so I'll come back. I'll type it in the chat if I think of it.
Brilliant. Thanks, Sarah. And Liz.
Yeah, totally agree. Shared objectives, incredibly important. Show us how the interventions, the programs that you're suggesting can produce multiple benefits. Show us about, talk to us about how, how it's coming up with loads of different wonderful solutions, as well as say just water quantity or quality. Talk about the benefits to nature and soil and climate. Tell us all about that, and the community aspect as well. And most importantly, don't forget the sort of power of a good show and tell. I really think it's absolutely fantastic, especially for people who've been, sitting in offices, sadly, like we've been doing, or rather at home at the moment, but who can be genuinely inspired by local examples of what's possible on the ground, and who can actually go and meet the farmers, see the issues maybe, and understand how by their action and involvement that some of these solutions can be found. So show and tell, good relationships, power of relationships.
Brilliant. Go on, Scott.
Final point for me, just on the knowledge and expertise point. I think of course there's areas where it's important to collaborate and understand where that knowledge and expertise is. So it's not always there's always some areas where that can be gained further through collaboration, and it's about understanding where the knowledge and expertise is to address a shared challenge and contributing in the ways that we all can.
Excellent. Right, I am very conscious of time. I have one final question, which I'm contractually obliged to ask you because I work for the Rivers Trust. I'd like each of you just to let me know what your favourite river is and why. And we'll start with you, Christina, if you may.
Sure. So I'm actually more of a lake person, I'm sorry, but I like to swim in lakes. But yeah, I do obviously love rivers, and I suppose my favourite one, it's a really hard question because there's so many, is probably the River Wye. And that's because my aunt and uncle lived down there, and I have a lot of fond childhood memories of racing my uncle to the top of Simmons Yacht and then having that beautiful view over the Wye.
Lovely. Thank you. Sarah?
So my favourite river is the River Wear in County Durham, and that's because I grew up in Durham, and I used to kayak, and so at one point I'm sure I was more River Wear than person because of the amount I swallowed as I capsized. It could do with a bit of cleaning up, but it's a really, really nice river.
Thank you. Scott, and then we'll go to Liz finally.
I think mine was actually just answered. I was going to suggest there was a clue in the question. You said the favourite river and why, and it was going to be the Wye. So obviously being Buxton based, the River Wye.
Brilliant. There are a number of different Wyes across the country, I have to hasten to point out. And then finally, Liz.
So I think mine has to be the River Itchen. Because it was the river that frankly sort of made me just absolutely fall in love with water stewardship, because it was the river that the WWF team took me to probably about 10 years ago, and it's just so beautiful, clear chalk stream river at it, and obviously not all of it is healthy, sadly, but at its best stretches it is just breathtaking.
Right, well, on that moment's inspiration, I'd like to thank you all very much again for your time and your contributions. I think there's probably not that many questions we haven't covered off, but we'll try and cover those off in the chat. And with that, I shall hand back to Christine, I think, for final words and thanks. So thank you all again.
Okay.
Thanks, Alex, and thanks all the panelists. Okay, I've got -4 minutes just to wrap up very quickly. Just to say a big thank you to all of you who've joined us today. And we actually want this to be the start of a conversation and kind of not just the main part of it. So Becca will be sending out a survey in the coming week to find out what you enjoyed about this and what you'd like to carry on talking about. Hearing about, learning about, and questioning. So yeah, it's been a really very broad overview. I hope we've brought something new to all of you today. I know that a lot of people are already working and have a lot of experience in water stewardship. So there was a lot of ground to cover, but it really sounds as though this whole issue about connecting the water stewardship practitioners on the ground with the businesses who have a real desire to see it happening and supporting it happening, there's still a bit of a gap there. So we've still got work to do there. And clearly the whole issue of the urgency in terms of building this local resilience to cope with the impacts of climate change is very, very pressing. So thank you all. We hope to engage with you again next year. We're looking forward to a series of webinars, more about water stewardship, more about climate resilience, and what we can do better together. So meanwhile, hope you all have a lovely Christmas and a great break later on this month. Thank you. And thanks so much to Becca, most of all, for organising us all. And yeah, big clap to Becca Duncan, for keeping us all together and coping with all the technology behind the scenes. Thanks, Becca. Okay, bye everyone.